Hey, you made it. Welcome back, my friend. Get comfortable. Pull that blanket a little closer and let the world outside go quiet for a little while. Tonight, we're not going anywhere stressful. Tonight, I am taking you somewhere gentle, somewhere ancient, somewhere that smells of cool water, with smoke, and freshly turned earth. Tonight, we're going to the river. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine this. It is the year 1200. Europe is alive in a way most of us have never known. No electric lights, no paved roads stretching to the horizon, no gas stations, no grocery stores, no delivery trucks pulling up to your door. Just villages, forests, fields, and cutting right through all of it like a silver thread stitched through an old tapestry. The river. And here's the thing that historians have been saying for a long time, but somehow never quite makes it into the story we tell ourselves about the Middle Ages. Every single great city you have ever heard of from medieval Europe, every famous cathedral town, every market hub, every center of power and beauty and conflict was built on a riverbank. Every single one. Paris on the Seine, London on the Thames, Cologne on the Rhine, Vienna on the Danube. Now, here's the part that truly gets me. This was not a coincidence. This was not a lucky accident of history. People in the Middle Ages understood something about rivers that we, with our highways and our Amazon Prime, have almost completely forgotten. A river was not just water. A river was everything. It was your grocery store, your highway, your source of power, your church in a way, your greatest comfort, and sometimes your most terrifying enemy. And if you were born within walking distance of one of Europe's great rivers in the Middle Ages, your entire life from your first breath to your last will be shaped by its current. So tonight we begin a journey, 12 parts, 12 windows into a world built on water. We're going to walk along the banks of the Thames and the Seine, the Rhine and the Danube, and meet the people who fished them, crossed them, prayed beside them, feared them, and loved them. Before we dive in, if these stories mean something to you, if you find yourself settling in a little deeper, breathing a little slower, feeling like the world outside is gone, just a little quieter, then I would love it if you took a moment to subscribe, hit that like button, or even just drop a quick comment below telling me where you're watching from right now. Are you in bed on a couch somewhere? Maybe stuck in an airport at some strange hour with nothing but your earbuds in this video? Tell me. I genuinely love knowing. And if you have been watching for a while, and this channel has become part of your nighttime routine, sharing it with someone who needs a quiet corner of the internet is honestly one of the kindest things you can do for me. Now turn the lights down if you can. Let everything else go, and let us go back together. Let us start with something almost impossibly simple. Why rivers? We take it for granted now. We glance at a map of Europe, and we see the dots of cities sitting along blue lines, and we nod and we move on. But if you were a farmer, a merchant, a lord, or a simple village woman in the year one, the question of where to settle was not abstract. It was life or death. And rivers answered every question at once. First, there was the water itself. Fresh water clean enough to drink, to cook with, to water animals. In a world with no pipes, no pumps, no running taps, a river was the difference between a village that thrived and one that vanished in a summer drought. The Thames historians have noted was not merely London's backdrop. It was London's reason for being. The ancient GIC settlement that became Paris sat right on the Isle d'Isette, a small island cradled in the arms of the Seine, surrounded by water on all sides, protected by the river like a child held in two hands. The founders were not being poetic. They were being practical. Water meant survival. Water meant defense. Water meant life. Second, there was food. And this is where things get genuinely fascinating, because the rivers of medieval Europe were not the relatively quiet waterways we see today. They were absolutely teeming. Salmon ran up the Thames in such numbers that there are records of medieval landlords complaining that their servants were being fed salmon too frequently. Too frequently. Imagine that. Today, people pay enormous sums of money for wild salmon. In medieval London, servants were reportedly being given it so often they found it monotonous. The Rhine, the Danube, and the Seine were similarly rich. Eels in particular were so plentiful and so valued that they were sometimes used almost like currency. Monasteries, lords, and wealthy merchants all demanded them. The river did not just feed the village, it fed the whole social structure. Third, and perhaps most importantly, for how medieval civilization actually functioned, there was transport. And here's a number that stops me every time I think about it. Moving goods by river in the Middle Ages was estimated to be around 30 times cheaper than moving the same goods over land. 30 times. Think about that for a moment. If you were a merchant in the 13th century and you had a choice between loading your wool onto a cart and struggling it down a muddy bandit-riddled road, or loading it onto a flat-bottomed boat and floating it gently down to the nearest market town, the answer was not even a decision. It was obvious. Medieval boats were built cleverly for this. They had relatively flat bottoms, allowing them to navigate stretches of river that would be completely impossible for modern vessels. Grain from towns upriver of Oxford traveled down the Thames to London. Barley moved from the eastern coastal counties around by sea and then up the rivers. Wine from France moved up the Seine from the coast into the heart of the country. The rivers of Europe were not scenic features. They were the highways. They were the arteries. And all along those arteries, every mile or so, there were people, fishermen, millers, ferrymen, merchants, bridge-keepers, priests, and ordinary families who woke up every morning to the sound of moving water and built their entire understanding of the world around that sound. Now, here's something that tends to surprise people when they first learn it. The great rivers of medieval Europe were not 5 or 6 separate, isolated things. They were a network, a connected web of water that linked the entire continent in ways that medieval people understood intuitively, even if they never had a map spread in front of them. The Rhine flows roughly 1,230 kilometers from the Swiss Alps all the way north to the sea in the Netherlands. It passes through 6 countries, or at least 6 territories that are now countries. The Danube flows even longer, 2,850 kilometers through the heart of Europe, connecting what would become Austria, Hungary, Serbia, Romania, and eventually emptying into the Black Sea. The Thames, much shorter but enormously powerful in terms of trade and civilization, linked London to the sea and to the rest of England. The sun gave France its commercial backbone. The Po running across northern Italy was the quieter but equally vital artery feeding the fields and towns of one of the most productive agricultural regions in medieval Europe. Together, these rivers formed something almost like a medieval internet. Not of data, obviously, but of grain, of wine, of wool, of salt, of timber, of people, of ideas, and of news. A merchant on the Rhine in Cologne knew what was happening in Basel weeks before a traveler on foot could have covered the same distance. A letter put on a boat at Paris could reach Rouen in a fraction of the time it would take a horseman struggling along muddy roads. The rivers moved faster than almost anything else medieval Europe had. And so the towns along the rivers grew and grew and grew. By the time we reached the High Middle Ages, roughly the 11th through the 13th centuries, virtually every city of significance in Western Europe was built on the banks of one of these great rivers. This was not accidental. It was the result of hundreds of years of human beings making the most rational decision available to them. Water equals life. Water equals food. Water equals trade. Build here, stay here, defend this. Now, I want to pause for just a moment here because I think it is worth sitting with something that often gets lost in the big historical picture. When we talk about medieval Europe, we tend to imagine castles and knights and plague and hardship. And those things were real. They were absolutely real. But the people living along these rivers were not just surviving. They were building something. They were creating communities that in some cases have lasted in one form or another for 1,000 years. The fisherman's family on the Thames in 1200. The miller's daughter on the Rhine in 1150. The young merchant loading his boat on the Seine in 1300. These were real people. They had favorite spots on the riverbank. They had foods they loved. They had quarrels with their neighbors. They told stories to their children at night. And almost every single one of those stories at some point would have been about the river, because the river was always there. It was always moving. It was always giving and occasionally terrifyingly taking away. The rivers were not the backdrop of medieval life. They were the main character. And what we're going to discover together over these next 11 parts is just how deeply, how completely, how almost unimaginably that was true. We're going to meet the fishermen who practically owned their section of the river and fought vicious legal battles to keep it. We're going to spend time with the millers who ran the most important machines in their entire region and were simultaneously the most despised men in town. We're going to stand on the medieval bridges and look down at the water and Try to understand what it felt like to know that the bridge beneath your feet was genuinely one of the engineering wonders of its age. We're going to watch the floods come. We're going to feel the river freeze. We're going to hear the prayers that people whispered to the water when they did not know who else to ask. But before we get to any of that, let us go back to the very beginning. Let us stand on the bank. Let us smell the water. And let us understand, truly understand, what it meant to wake up every single morning of your medieval life and hear that river moving. Because coming right up next, we're going to step into one of the most important and least told stories in all of medieval history. The story of what the river actually gave the people who lived beside it. Not just water, not just fish, but survival itself. And the story begins in a way that might just change how you look at every river you ever cross again. Right at the end of part one, we stood back and looked at the full picture. We mapped out what the river meant in the broadest possible terms as highway, as boundary, as the spine on which every great medieval city was built. But that was the view from above. Now I want to come down from that height. I want to walk right to the water's edge and ask the most basic question that anyone who lived beside a medieval river had to answer every single day of their lives. What does this river actually give me? Not in terms of trade routes or political power or economic theory. Just practically, physically, what does it give me? The answer turns out to be everything. And I mean that almost literally. Let's start with something so fundamental that it is easy to overlook entirely. Water. Plain actual water to drink. Now, there is a persistent myth about the Middle Ages that has been repeated in popular books and television documentaries for decades. And it goes roughly like this: medieval people never drank water because the water was so contaminated they only drank ale and wine. I want to be clear about this myth because it matters. It is mostly wrong. Medieval people absolutely drank water. 9th century Abbot Lupus of Ferry wrote about it, directly recommending, as he put it, a healthy natural drink, which will sometimes be a benefit to both body and soul if it is drawn not from a muddy system, but from a clear well or the current of a transparent brook. The 10th century educational text, known as Elphic's Colloquy, contains a student, who when asked what he would drink replies, "I'll eat if I have any, or water if I have no ale. Water first, ale as the backup," which is the opposite of how the myth presents it. Medieval people were not idiots. They knew perfectly well that clear moving water from a river upstream of the town was generally safe to drink. They knew that standing water was dangerous. They knew that drawing water downstream of where the tanneries disposed of their waste was a bad idea. Medieval cities developed specific regulations addressing exactly this problem, placing noxious trades like leather tanning and slaughterhouse operations on the downstream side of the city, while clean water was drawn from the upstream side. The rules were enforced with significant financial penalties. You did not pollute the drinking water supply in a medieval town and walk away lightly. In the 13th century, the City of London went one step further. They built what became known as the conduit, using a system of lead pipes. And yes, the Romans had used lead pipes too. But let us save that particular irony for another day. The conduit carried fresh water from a spring outside the city walls into the heart of London, where residents could freely access it at a public system. City records note the expenses of maintaining and cleaning the conduit, and through the 14th and 15th centuries the system was expanded to additional neighborhoods. On special public celebrations such as the return of a king from a campaign or a royal coronation, the city would stop the water flow entirely and instead fill the conduit system with wine, which citizens could drink freely until it ran out. Wine from the taps. Can you imagine turning on your tap during a national holiday and wine coming out? That is the medieval equivalent of a parade with free drinks for everyone. And you wonder why people love their kings a little more on those days. But back to the river itself, because the conduit, impressive as it was, did not exist in most of medieval Europe. For the overwhelming majority of people living beside rivers in England, France, Germany, and the rest of the continent, the river was the water supply. Full stop. And the relationship between people and their river water was intimate in a way we genuinely cannot imagine from inside our modern infrastructure. A historian studying medieval Italian cities notes that rivers and wells formed the primary water supply for most medieval towns, and their accessibility made them central to daily routines. Households collected water directly from riverbanks or communal wells, using it for drinking, cooking, washing, and brewing. Young women and children in many communities made the daily trip to the river with wooden buckets or clay jugs balanced on a carrying yoke, one on each shoulder. This trip happened every single day, rain or shine, summer and winter. In the dark of an early morning, when frost still lay on the bank, the river was not a destination. It was a routine. It was as automatic as reaching for a glass of water in your kitchen. Except the kitchen was a mile away. The glass was a clay jug, and you had to carry it home. Now, here's where the story deepens significantly. Because medieval people did not just take water from the river. They took something else from it that was arguably even more important in the long term. They took fertility. The seasonal flooding of European rivers was not, in the medieval understanding, a disaster to be prevented. It was a gift to be managed. Think about this carefully because it shifts the whole relationship. When the sun flooded its banks each spring, it did not just fill the lower streets of Paris with muddy inconvenience. It deposited a layer of rich alluvial silt across the meadows and low fields on both sides. Nutrient-rich, naturally fertilizing, the kind of soil enrichment that a modern farmer achieves with purchased inputs arrived every year free of charge delivered by the river. Medieval farmers understood this intuitively. A historical study of Anglo-Saxon river use makes the point explicitly. The seasonal flooding of rivers helped grow the meadow grass that provided the hay essential for winter food for livestock. Hay. Without hay stored before winter, livestock died. Without livestock, the entire agricultural system weakened because animals provided not just meat and milk, but the draft power that pulled the plows and the manure that kept the fields productive. So, the river's flood was not just a water event. It was a critical step in the hay cycle, which fed the animals, which kept the farms working, which fed the people. Remove the seasonal flood from the equation, and the whole system wobbles. Medieval farmers along the rivers of England and France actually took this logic one step further. In some areas, particularly along the English Thames Valley, and in parts of Normandy along the Seine communities, developed what historians describe as water meadow systems. The basic principle was this. You deliberately channeled river water across low-lying grass meadows in early spring, often by cutting shallow irrigation channels from the river. The water, even in late winter and early spring, was warmer than the frozen ground it flowed over. That slight warmth protected the grass from frost. It caused the meadow to green up weeks earlier than surrounding unwatered fields. And that early grass meant early spring grazing for cattle and sheep at exactly the point in the year when the stored winter hay was running out. The river, used intelligently, could push the effective end of winter back by several weeks. A few weeks might not sound significant, but in a subsistence agricultural system where a late frost or a shortage of winter feed could tip a village from adequacy into genuine hunger, a few weeks mattered enormously. Now, I want to ask you something, and I mean this is a genuine question, not a rhetorical one. When was the last time you thought about where your water actually came from? Not in a crisis moment, not during a news story about a drought somewhere far away, but just casually on a Tuesday morning in the natural course of your day. For most of us, the honest answer is almost never. We turn a tap, the water appears, the infrastructure is so successful, so complete that it has made itself effectively invisible. But for every person who lived beside the medieval river, the water was never invisible. You saw where it came from. You carried it home in your own hands. You knew which stretch was clear and which stretch ran brown after a heavy rain. You knew not to draw from below the Tanners on a hot day. You knew that the upstream bend gave better water in summer than the main channel. You knew the river's moods because your survival depended on knowing them. That knowledge was not written down in textbooks. It lived in muscle memory, in daily habit, in the accumulated wisdom of people who'd been carrying water from the same river for generations. The relationship between medieval people and their river water was complicated by one additional factor that deserves its own moment. The river, generous as it was with its clean water upstream, was less friendly further down. As medieval cities grew in the later Middle Ages, the pressure on river water increased. Industries multiplied, populations concentrated, and all of that human activity produced waste that ended up eventually in the water. The tanners soaked their hides. The butchers cleaned their tools. The dyers rinsed their colored cloth and less savory materials, which we will simply call domestic waste, and leave it that work their way into the system as well. A London record from 1390 describes a fishmonger who had been disposing of rotten fish in a public well. He was discovered. 12 more barrels of rotten fish were found in his house. All of it was carted out of the city and buried with considerable official urgency, because the city authorities understood with great clarity that contaminated water supplies meant sick people, and sick people meant disrupted commerce, and disrupted commerce meant lost revenue. Medieval public health was often less about compassion and more about economics. But the result was regulation oversight. Early attempts at something that would eventually become what we recognize as sanitation infrastructure. The river taught the city slowly, and sometimes painfully, that managing water was a civic responsibility, not just a personal one. And throughout all of this, running beneath the practical and the economic and the political, there was something else, something harder to quantify. The river for medieval people was alive. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Alive in the sense that it had personality and moods and the capacity to give and take without warning. The 9th century writer who praised a transparent brook was not being sentimental. He was describing a real entity with real qualities that you needed to understand if you wanted to use it safely. Medieval people did not manage rivers so much as they negotiated with them. They adjusted their planting to the flood cycle. They built their houses just far enough above the water line. They drew their drinking supply from the upstream curve and kept their waste downstream. They were in a constant, daily, practical conversation with moving water. And the river, as it always does, responded to what was brought to it. Respect it. And it gave you hay and fish and clean water and fertile soil and a highway to the next town. Ignore it or abuse it. And it gave you contaminated wells and flooded streets and the kind of public health crisis that could hollow out a city in weeks. We have spent time with the water today, with what it gave, with how medieval communities understood it and drew from it, and at their best protected it. But there is something waiting for us just beneath the surface of everything we have discussed. Something that the river gave in such extraordinary abundance that it became the foundation of the entire medieval food calendar. The subject of legal battles, the center of religious controversy, and the livelihood of one of the most important professions that most people have never thought much about: fish. Specifically, the men who caught them. And what happened when one of the most powerful institutions in medieval Europe decided that fish was the only acceptable food for nearly half the year. The fishermen are at the river, and they have been waiting for us since before dawn. Something is already waiting for you at the river. You just do not know it yet. Picture a cold morning on the Thames sometime around the year 1250. The sky is still the color of pale ash. Mist sits low on the water, thick enough that you can barely see the far bank. And then out of that mist, a sound, not one sound actually, a whole conversation of sounds. The soft knock of wood against wood as a boat is pushed off a muddy bank. The slap of a net hitting the surface. A man's voice low and rough, saying something that carries across the water, but makes no sense from where you're standing. And then the pull and splash of something alive being dragged from the river. The fisherman is already at work. He has been at work, in fact, since before you woke up. He was probably at work before you even fell asleep. Now, I want to tell you something that I think about every single time I eat fish. In medieval Europe, fish was not a luxury. It was not a delicacy for the wealthy. Fish was not the kind of thing you reserve for a special occasion. Fish was in a very real and very urgent since the foundation of the entire food system. And the reason for that is something that modern life has almost completely erased from our daily experience. Religion, specifically the fasting rules of the Catholic Church, which in the Middle Ages governed not just Sunday mornings, but the actual daily choices of what millions of people were permitted to eat. Here is the number that stops most people cold when they hear it for the first time. Medieval Christians were expected to abstain from eating meat on approximately 150 days out of every single year. 150 days. That is almost 5 full months out of 12. Fridays were meatless as a rule. Saturdays were meatless in many traditions. And then there was Lent, the 40 days before Easter, when the restrictions tightened further. Then there were the vigils before major feast days, the Advent season, and a scattering of additional fast days distributed throughout the calendar. Add it all up, and you're looking at roughly 40% of the entire year when the average medieval person from peasant to nobleman was supposed to fill their plate without meat. Now, for most of history, when people say they abstained from meat, they replaced it with something, And that something overwhelmingly was fish, which means the medieval fisherman was not simply feeding people. He was feeding the religious calendar itself. He was the man standing between the church's rules and the hunger of an entire civilization. No pressure. And can I just say, as someone who finds this genuinely fascinating, that this changes how you see everything about the medieval river. The reason those rivers were so crowded, so contested, so fiercely fought over is not just that people liked fish. It is that people needed fish the way we need electricity today. A river that stopped producing was not an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe. Which brings me to the structures. Because the medieval fisherman did not simply show up at the river with a rod and a bit of hope the way a lot of us imagine fishing. He was an engineer, a strategist. Sometimes, frankly, something close to a warlord about his particular stretch of water. The primary tools were not rods. They were wares. A fish weir in the Middle Ages was a large, semi-permanent structure built directly into the river. Imagine two long arms of wooden stakes or stones angled inward toward each other in a wide shape, narrowing down to a point where a basket or net was placed. The fish would swim naturally into the open mouth of the weir, follow the current inward, and find themselves funneled into a trap from which there was no escape. The design was elegant in the way that the best medieval engineering often was. It required no bait. It required no waiting. It worked with the river rather than against it. And it worked continuously, catching fish all night long while the fishermen slept, which is, when you think about it, the medieval equivalent of passive income. The river was making money for you while you were not even watching. But here's where things get genuinely complicated and genuinely human. And depending on your perspective, genuinely infuriating, because those we did not just catch fish, they blocked the river. And a blocked river was a problem for absolutely everyone else. The merchant trying to move a loaded barge upstream. The miller downstream who needed water flow for his wheel. The next village that depended on fish, making it further upriver to spawn and keep the local population fed. The we created a fundamental conflict that played out again and again in courtrooms and village squares, and occasionally an outright physical confrontation for hundreds of years across every major river in Europe. On the Thames alone, a census taken in the year 1421 counted many hundreds of fish, wares, and traps of various kinds operating in or immediately adjacent to the tidal river in the Este. Hundreds on a single river. Now imagine what that meant for anyone trying to move goods. Imagine you're a barge master trying to navigate upriver with a cargo of wine from France or grain from a market town. And every few miles there is another obstruction, another fisherman's claim on the water, another argument about the right of passage, another toll or delay or flat refusal to open a gap in the weir until proper payment was made. It was, by any honest description, a mess. And the mess got so serious that it ended up in one of the most famous legal documents in the history of the English-speaking world, the Magna Carta. Clause 33 of the Magna Carta, signed in the year 1215, stated clearly that all fish wares were to be removed from the Thames, the Medway, and throughout the whole of England except on the sea coast. All of them gone. Now historians have sometimes called this clause the joke of the Magna Carta, because the we clearly did not disappear. Legislation banning we on the four great rivers of England, specifically the Thames, the Severn, the Ouse, and the Trent, was repeated on at least 9 separate occasions between 1370 and 1495. 9 times. The same rule, 9 times. Which tells you something rather beautiful and rather exasperating about human nature, does it not? When a law needs to be restated 9 times in the space of 125 years, it is a fairly reliable sign that nobody is actually following it. The fishermen kept building their wreck complaining. The kings kept issuing orders, and the river kept flowing. Do you ever wonder what it would have felt like to be one of those fishermen standing in cold water up to your chest before dawn, pulling a net, knowing full well that what you were doing was technically illegal, but also completely necessary for your family to survive the winter? There is a record from the 1390s in which a group of fishermen from the communities of Woolwich and Greenwich, described in the documents as the poor lees of the river, petitioned the King of England. They were not asking for anything grand. They were not asking for land or title or wealth. They were asking for the right to continue fishing the way their fathers had fished with their boats and their nets and their fixed traps in the waters where they had always fished. And in their petition, they made a very specific argument. They said that their fishing did not just feed their own families. It supplied the city of London. All of it. The entire city and the surrounding countryside too. They were, in other words, telling the king something very plainly. If you take this from us, the people of London go hungry on fast days. And given that fast days were roughly 150 days a year, that was not a small claim. That was a threat wrapped in a petition wrapped in humility. Now, alongside the we, there was something else happening on the medieval river that deserves its own moment of attention. The eel. I know the eel is not exactly the most charismatic creature we could spend time with tonight. But I am asking you to give the eel just a few minutes of your full attention, because the story of medieval Europe's relationship with the eel is one of the stranger and more revealing things I have ever come across in history. Eels were by nearly every measure the most important freshwater creature in medieval England. Not salmon, not trout, not pike eels. They were found almost everywhere in every river, every stream, every mill pond, and every marshy backwater across the country. They were cheap to catch, easy to preserve, and packed with the kind of dense caloric energy that a hard-working medieval body genuinely needed. They were eaten fresh, smoked, salted, pickled, baked into pies, stuffed with herbs, and prepared in at least a dozen ways that have mostly been forgotten. And then there was the church's position on eels, which is where this story takes a turn that I personally find both deeply strange and strangely logical. Because the church permitted eels during fast days, not just tolerated them, actively endorsed them. The reasoning, as it was explained at the time, was that the eel was essentially asexual in its visible habits. Nobody had ever seen an eel reproduce. Nobody had ever seen a baby eel in the way you might see a calf or a lamb. The eel just appeared fully formed in the water, and the church concluded that an animal without apparent sexual reproduction could not be said to excite carnal appetites in the way that meat associated with animals of obvious earthly desire might. The eel was in a sense spiritually safe, theologically inoffensive, the approved substitute for red meat on 150 days of the year, which if you sit with it for a moment, is genuinely hilarious. The fate of an empire's food system resting partly on medieval theologians' uncertainty about how eels reproduced. But the numbers are what truly floor me. By the end of the 11th century, eels were being used so extensively across England that they had become, in a very practical sense, a form of currency. The Domesday Book, King William the Conqueror's Great Survey of England, completed in the year 1086, lists hundreds of examples of people making payments in eels, not coins, eels. The unit was called a stick, which meant a bundle of 25 eels, or a bind, which was 10. Rents were paid in eels. Mills paid their dues in eels. Fishermen settled their obligations in eels. And by the end of that century, historical estimates suggest that over 540,000 eels were being used as currency across England in a single year. 540,000 used not as food at that moment, but as money. Stop for a second and imagine walking into a shop today and paying for your groceries with a bundle of live eels. The shopkeeper would have a reasonable reaction. In 1200, the shopkeeper would have simply counted them and handed you your change. On the Seine in France and on the Rhine through Germany, the picture was remarkably similar, though with its own regional texture. In the great delta formed by the Rhine's lower reaches, historians have traced a massive expansion of eel fishing from roughly the 13th century onward. As the low-lying peatlands were drained for farming, they subsided, creating vast, shallow, freshwater lakes, exactly the kind of still, turbid, fertile habitat where eels thrived in astonishing numbers. One community in southern France, a small settlement called Maguelone, documented its eel consumption in a set of statutes from the year 1331. Their figure was approximately 90,000 eels per year for one small community in 1 year. The scale of this is almost impossible to picture until you try to actually picture it. That is roughly 246 eels consumed every single day by one small settlement. What strikes me most about all of this when I step back and look at a whole is not the economics, though. Those are remarkable. It is the intimacy. The medieval fisherman knew his river the way we might know a close friend. He knew which bend held the best salmon run in March. He knew where the eels concentrated in winter, burying themselves into the muddy river bottom in dense, tangled nests. He knew the exact pitch of the current at his weir that told him the trap was full. He knew the look of the water when a flood was coming 3 days before it arrived. The river was not a resource to him. It was a relationship, a living, breathing, unpredictable relationship that he had inherited from his father and would one day pass to his son. And protecting that relationship sometimes meant fighting for it. There are records of what historians politely describe as armed confrontation between Tempesty fishermen and London officials attempting to enforce the rules about mesh size and illegal traps. Armed confrontation over mesh size, which honestly only makes sense when you understand that for those fishermen, the argument was never really about nets. It was about survival. It was about feeding their children on the fast days that kept coming back 150 times a year, every year, no matter what. And there's one more detail I want to leave you with before we move on, because it has never quite left me since I first read it. After the Magna Carta's clause about fishes was issued in 1215, something unexpected happened. The salmon came back, not immediately, not all at once, but within a few years of the worst we being cleared, the rivers of England began to teem with salmon in a way that apparently surprised even the people who had fought for the clearing. So much salmon appeared in the waters that there is a record cited by historians of medieval monastic life, of monks at certain abbeys pleading with their abbots for greater variety in the kitchen. This salmon was becoming monotonous. We've already discussed back in part 1 the general notion of servants complaining about salmon appearing too often in their diet. But this is something slightly different and more specific. This is the monks, the men of God, the ones who had presumably welcomed the abundance as a blessing, now quietly writing to say that enough was perhaps enough. There is something deeply and recognizably human in that detail. You fight for a thing. You win. You get rather more of the thing than you expected. And then, standing in front of your plate of salmon for the 17th time that month, you begin to have complicated feelings about the whole situation. The medieval river could do that. It could overwhelm you with its generosity just as surely as it could devastate you with its fury. And speaking of fury, we have not yet met the one man who stood at the center of the river's power, who controlled the water in a way that made even the fishermen nervous, who was simultaneously indispensable and despised in every village from England to the Rhine Valley. Coming up next, we step into the world of the miller. And I promise you, the story of the medieval miller is not what you expect. Not even close. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Think about the last time someone in your life had power over you that you could not get around. Not power that you could argue with. Not power that you could walk away from. But the kind of deeply inconvenient, quietly infuriating power that simply existed as a fact of your world. Maybe it was a landlord. Maybe it was a boss. Maybe it was the one gas station for 20 miles in either direction on a long road. Now hold that feeling, because I'm about to introduce you to the one man in every medieval village who made even the toughest peasant clench his jaw and look at the ground. The miller. And I want to say from the start that the story of the medieval miller is not simple. It is not a story of pure villain. It is not a story of pure victimhood either. It is something far more interesting than both of those things. It is a story about what happens when one person controls something that everyone else desperately needs, and how that kind of power reshapes a human being, whether they want it to or not. The watermill was, without any exaggeration, the most sophisticated piece of technology that most medieval people would encounter in their entire lives. By the time the Dome's debut King William the Conqueror's Great Survey of England was completed in the year 1086, there were over 6,000 mills recorded across England alone. 6,000. Historians have calculated that this works out to roughly 1 mill for every 2 settlements in the country. That number should genuinely stop you for a moment. In a world where nearly every tool was made by hand, where the most powerful machine most families owned was a set of iron plowshares and a yoke for their ox, the watermill was something else entirely. It was a machine that harnessed the river itself, a turning wheel driven by the current, transferring that energy through wooden shafts to a set of millstones that ground grain into flour with a speed and consistency no human hand could match. The bottom stone sat perfectly still. The top stone rotated, driven by the river below, and between the two of them, they crushed the grain that the entire village depended on for its daily bread. If you have never seen a working watermill, I want you to imagine the sound, a deep rhythmic grinding that you can feel in your chest, a vibration in the floorboards, the constant rush of water beneath the wheel, the smell of dust slightly warm, slightly sweet, rising from the stones. It is not a dramatic sound, but it is the sound of survival. Because without that sound, there was no flour. Without flour, there was no bread. And in medieval Europe, bread was not a side item. Bread was the meal. Here is something that gets lost when people think about medieval food. The diet of an ordinary medieval person was by our standards extraordinarily grain-heavy. Bread, porridge, and ale, all made from ground grain, formed the foundation of what most people ate most of the time. Not as a preference, as a necessity, which meant that the meal was not a convenience. It was as essential to village life as the well or the church, and whoever controlled the meal controlled something fundamental about everyone else's existence. That person was the miller. But here is the twist that changes everything. The miller did not actually own the mill. In medieval Europe, mills were almost exclusively built and owned by the lord of the manor. The capital required to construct a water mill, including the pond, the channel called a leak, that directed water to the wheel itself, and the carefully dressed millstones that had to be shaped with extraordinary precision was simply beyond the means of any ordinary person. Only the Lord had the money. Only the Lord had the land rights to dam a river or cut a channel. So the mill belonged to the Lord, and because the mill belonged to the Lord, so did the right to grind grain. This was formalized across medieval Europe under a system the French called the ban, elite, meaning roughly the Lord's ban, his command, his compulsory obligation, imposed on those beneath him. The law in most of England and France, and much of the Holy Roman Empire, was clear. Peasants were required to bring their grain to the Lord's mill, only to the Lord's mill. They were forbidden from grinding it themselves. And this is where things become genuinely complicated in a human way. Because think about what that means in practice. If you were a peasant with a small hand mill in your house, a simple stone tool that had been in your family for generations, and you quietly used it on a cold January morning to grind enough grain for the week's bread without making the long walk to the mill in the mud, you were breaking the law. Not technically breaking the law, actually breaking the law. And the consequences were real. If you were caught, your hand mill, called a queer, would be confiscated and destroyed. You would be fined. And if you had previously been caught on the road heading to a different mill, a rival mill, the manor's custom allowed the lord to seize your horse. While the miller himself was entitled to take whatever grain or flour you were carrying, there are records of the abbot of St. Albans, the powerful head of one of England's wealthiest monasteries, personally confiscating the quers of his tenants. He did not just take them, he had them smashed, and then with a level of symbolic cruelty that I find genuinely remarkable. He had the broken pieces laid into the floor of the abbey parlor as paving stones, so that every time a tenant walked into the room where the abbot received visitors, they were quite literally walking on the ruins of their own small, quiet resistance. That is a statement. Now the miller sat in the middle of this system as an enforcer, a gatekeeper, and a target all at once. He rented the mill from the lord, or was employed directly by the lord to collect the tolls. The toll was called the multure. It was a percentage of the grain that each customer brought taken in payment for the grinding service. For a serf, this toll was typically 1/16th of the grain or flour. For a freeman, the rate was slightly lower, which means that every time a family brought their grain to the mill, they left with less than they arrived with. A portion went to the lord. A portion in practice went to the miller, and the remainder went home to feed the family. Now on paper this sounds like a reasonable transaction. You bring raw grain, you receive ground flour, you pay a percentage for the service. The problem, and it is the problem that generated centuries of bitter resentment, was that the transaction happened entirely on the miller's terms, on the miller's premises, using the miller's equipment measured by the miller's hand. How do you verify that a man took 1/16th and not 114th? You trust him. And the medieval peasant, by long experience and hard evidence, did not trust the miller. Here is the reputation that millers had built up by the 14th century. And I want to read you something, because the words deserve to be heard. The poet Geoffrey Chaucer, writing his Canterbury Tales in the 1380s, described his miller character in the general prologue this way. The miller was a stout fellow, broad and powerfully built. He won every wrestling match he entered. He was capable of breaking a door with his head. He had a wart on his nose, and Chaucer wrote, he was a master hand at stealing grain. He told tavern stories filthy in the man, and the poet noted without any particular surprise the miller's thumb always seemed to find its way onto the scale. Now Chaucer was a literary genius, and his miller is a complex, almost likable character in the Fuller story. But what strikes me about that portrait is not the satire. It is the casualness of the dishonesty. Chaucer did not frame the miller's theft as a shocking revelation. He mentioned it the way you might mention that a carpenter is good with his hands. It was understood to be part of the job description because the opportunity was structural. It was built into the system itself. When you bring your grain to a mill and the miller grinds it and returns your flour in a sack, there's an information gap that simply cannot be closed. You cannot watch every grain. You cannot stand over the millstone for 3 hours. And the miller knew that. What I find genuinely fascinating, and this is the part that I think gets lost in the easy caricature, is that the miller was not simply a villain. He was a skilled craftsman operating under extraordinary pressure from multiple directions. He owed rent to the Lord. He had to maintain the mill at his own expense, and mills broke down constantly. The millstones, which had to be periodically redressed, meaning recut with fresh grooves, were enormously expensive. Flour dust caused serious respiratory disease over a lifetime of work. The milker catch fire and flour dust suspended in the air is, as we now know, genuinely explosive under the right conditions. Medieval people noticed that mills seemed to burn down with some regularity, which of course fed the suspicion that millers were setting their own fires deliberately to drive up prices. Whether any miller ever actually did this, the reputation was enough to add one more charge to a very long list. He was also in a peculiar way socially isolated. He was better off than most of his neighbors, which generated envy. He ate white bread every day because flour dust and wastage made that possible, while the peasants around him ate darker, coarser bread and considered white bread a luxury for feast days. He was associated in popular folklore across England, France, and Germany with the devil. There was a widespread belief that the miller worked with spirits, that the grinding wheel attracted dark forces, that a mill at night was a dangerous and uncanny place. When a miller was buried in some parts of medieval Germany and Central Europe, Moors apparently threw handfuls of flour after the coffin. The gesture was meant to keep his soul from returning to its old habits, which is, when you think about it, one of the most backhanded traditions I've ever encountered. Even in death, the assumption was that he would try to take something. Now, I want to draw your attention to something that happened in England in the year 1381, because it crystallizes everything I've been trying to describe about how people felt about this system. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was one of the most significant popular uprisings of medieval English history. Men and women from across the country rose against the grinding weight of feudal obligations, led in part by figures like Wat Tyler and the radical priest John B. And when the rebels arrived at St. Albans, one of the first things they did was storm the abbey. Not to take gold, not to burn manuscripts. They went to the parlor floor. They dug up the millstones that the abbot had set there as paving, and they broke them. They smashed those confiscated quarters that had been taken from their families, and they distributed the broken pieces among themselves as trophies, as proof that something had been reclaimed. I find that moment genuinely moving and genuinely complex because those fragments of stone represented 100 years of small humiliations. Every time a family had tried to grind their own grain and been fined for it, every mulcher paid resentfully, every long cold walk to the mill with a sack on your back, and the knowledge that you would come home lighter than you left. The millstone was not just a millstone. It was the whole system, and breaking it, even symbolically, even for just one afternoon of upheaval before the revolt, was eventually crushed meant something. Here is my honest personal take on a miller, and you can disagree with me on this. I would genuinely love to know what you think in the comments. I think the medieval miller is one of history's great middle figures. Not powerful enough to set the rules, but positioned just close. Enough to power to be resented by everyone beneath him. He was handed a structural advantage by the Lord's monopoly. And of course, some millers exploited it. Human beings, when given an information gap and a captive market, do not always choose virtue. But I also think he was trapped in a social position that made honest dealing extremely difficult, and then blamed personally for a system he did not design. The Lord who built the mill wrote the laws, and demanded the mulcher rarely appeared in the angry medieval ballads about dishonest men. The miller did because the miller had a face. The miller was in the village. The miller was the one you had to look in the eye when you handed over your grain and watch him measure it with that thumb on the scale. Power at a distance is easy to forgive, or at least to avoid thinking about. Power that stands right in front of you, smelling a flower with a wart on its nose, is considerably harder. So, we have the fisherman fiercely defending his stretch of water. We have the miller grinding the village's grain with one hand and pocketing a little of someone else's future with the other, and both of them depended in the most literal way on the same river. The fisherman needed the river to flow, freely full of fish unobstructed. The miller needed the river dammed, slowed, controlled, channeled precisely to his wheel. Two men, one river, and between them a conflict that played out in villages across medieval Europe for centuries. But neither the fisherman nor the miller ever had to face what was coming next, because just around the bend in the river, something was moving toward them that would transform their world completely. Something loaded with goods, driven by ambition, and watched very closely by men with swords and ledgers. The merchants were on the water, and the merchants, it turns out, had a great deal to say about who owned the river. You have just left the miller. You have watched him grind the grain and measure the toll and pocket a little more than his due, and you have felt the complicated mix of resentment and grudging acknowledgement that the medieval peasant carried whenever he thought about the man at the watermill. Now step back from the mill, walk down to the riverbank, look at the water, and now look upstream, because coming around the bend, moving slowly but steadily against the current, there is something approaching. A flat-bottomed barge riding low in the water from the weight of its cargo crew members. On the bank ahead, pulling it forward on long ropes attached to the bow. Others on the deck with poles, pushing off the riverbed in the shallower stretches. It is making its way from somewhere distant toward somewhere else entirely. And what it carries on its deck is about to tell you something extraordinary about how medieval Europe actually fed itself, clothed itself, and kept itself warm. Here is a number that I want you to hold in your mind for a moment. In the early 14th century, it cost 112 pennies per mile to transport a ton of grain by road. By river, the same journey cost half a penny per mile, one-third of the price. Now consider this. It costs more to transport wine 50 m overland than to ship it nearly 1,000 m from Bordeaux to London. Read that again because it bears sitting with. 50 m on a cart through the muddy roads of medieval France cost more than a sea river voyage of almost 000 miles. This is the economic reality that makes everything else about the medieval river make sense. The river was not just a useful option for merchants who happened to live near water. It was in most cases the only option that made commercial sense at all. Think about what the medieval road actually was in dry summer weather. A hard-packed route that a loaded cart could navigate at roughly 2 or 3 miles per hour if the horses were strong and the ruts were not too deep. After rain, a different story entirely. Medieval roads were largely unpaved. They became mud quickly. Carts became mired. Pack horses stumbled. Loads that had been carefully assembled at the point of origin arrived at the destination late, damaged, depleted, or not at all. And beyond the mud, there were the practical costs that do not show up in simple distance calculations. Pack animals needed to be fed. Their handlers needed accommodation overnight. In a world without modern bridges, every river crossing on a land route was a delay and an expense. Roads that crossed territories were subject to the same proliferating toll system we discussed when talking about the Rhine, with local lords extracting payment at bridges at gates at the entrances to market towns. The overland merchant of medieval Europe was in many ways an obstacle course runner who happened to be carrying barrels of wine. The river merchant, by contrast, had one route, one current, and physics on his side going downstream. Now, I want to be honest about something here, because the river was not always the easy option either. Going upstream was genuinely hard work. Traveling downstream, you had the current. The loaded barge moved with the water, guided by a crew who understood the river's eddies and shallows and bends. But going back upriver or trading in both directions, as most serious merchants did, required completely different methods. Where to paths existed along the bank, horses or oxmen were harnessed to long ropes attached to the bow and walked forward, hauling the barge against the current one slow step at a time. Where no toweth was available, crews went ashore on foot, anchored ropes ahead of the boat, and hauled it forward by brute human effort. In particularly difficult stretches, They pulled long wooden poles pushed against the riverbed, driving the vessel inch by laborious inch upstream. This was not glamorous. It was not fast. A journey that might take 2 days going downstream could take a week or more going back up the same river. And the hazards of the river itself made no allowance for the direction of your travel. Fish weirs. Those wooden and stone structures built across the width of the channel to funnel fish into traps were obstacles to navigation in every sense. Some weirs were built almost entirely across the river, leaving a narrow gap that a boat could only pass through at significant risk. Low bridges were another problem. Built cheap and flat across smaller rivers, they forced bargemen to partially unload their cargo, or sometimes to physically dismantle part of the barger's superstructure pass through the obstacle and reassemble on the other side. The millers, as we have seen, maintained what were called flash locks in their weirs, essentially a temporary gap that could be opened to allow a vessel through. Opening a flash lock released a sudden rush of water that swept the boat downstream through the gap with considerable violence. Going upstream through the same flash was even more dramatic. The crew would haul the boat up against the torrent of water pouring through the gap, fighting every foot of progress against a current specifically designed to be powerful. The miller charged a fee for this. Of course he did. What was actually moving on these rivers? The answer tells you everything about what medieval civilization needed in order to function. Grain was the single most important cargo on most English rivers. The Thames carried enormous quantities of grain from towns upriver of Oxford all the way down to London from places like Henley and the town of Wallingford. The city needed this grain the way any city needs its food supply reliably and in bulk. Had it come by road, historians have calculated that for some cargoes, particularly hay and grain, in large quantities, the transportation cost would have equaled or exceeded the value of the goods themselves. You would arrive in London having spent more on getting there than you could possibly sell the cargo for. The river made the transaction viable. Salt was another critical cargo moving along the Rhine and Seine and the rivers of England in enormous quantities. Salt was not a condiment in the medieval world. It was food preservation technology. Without salt, fish and meat could not be stored through the winter months. Without salted provisions, armies could not march. Sea voyages could not be made. Monastic communities could not sustain themselves through Lent. Salt moved by river because salt was heavy, and heavy things moved by water. Timber came down river in vast quantities, sometimes as finished planks and beams, sometimes as raw logs, floated loose on the current and gathered at downstream collection points. Leave from the mines of Derbyshire in England traveled by river, while England's great export commodity was collected at upriver towns and barged downstream to ports where it was loaded onto coastal and ocean-going ships heading for the cloth towns of Flanders, and wine, always wine. The wine trade of medieval Europe was extraordinary in its reach. The famous triangular route through which Bordeaux wine traveled to London, where ships loaded English wool for Flanders, which in turn sent finished cloth toward Italy, depended at every stage on water. Bordeaux sat on the Garonne. London sat on the Thames. The ports of Flanders sat at the mouths of the Scheldt and the Rhine. Water was not incidental to this trade. Water was the trade. Have you ever thought about what it would feel like to be that merchant on the barge? Not the wealthy Italian banker who financed the wine voyage from a comfortable office in Florence, calculating his expected returns in the warm lamplight, but the actual man on the actual barge, the one who spent days and weeks on the river knowing the vessel's temperament in different currents, reading the sky for weather, negotiating the flashes with a crew who needed paying and feeding and managing. There are records from English and French medieval sources of merchants traveling before setting off on a significant journey, making their wills. That is not poetic exaggeration. A serious overland journey or a long river voyage in the medieval period carried genuine and recognized risk. Travelers formed armed companies for protection against bandits when they had to use roads. They made religious offerings before departing. They commended themselves to their patron saints. The historian who recorded the commercial life of Sturbridge Fair near Cambridge describes northern English merchants setting out on their annual journeys to London with the solemnity of men who understood they might not come back. The river was cheaper than the road, yes, but cheaper is not the same as safe. What the river commerce of medieval Europe created slowly and somewhat accidentally was something that historians call the commercial revolution. Through the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, as river trade expanded and became more reliable and more sophisticated, something began to change in the texture of European life. Towns that sat on navigable rivers grew faster than towns that did not. Markets appeared at river confluences where merchants stopped to trade because a merchant moving upstream had to stop, and a stopped merchant with a cargo was a commercial opportunity for everyone nearby. New kinds of merchants appeared, people who did not grow or make anything themselves, who specialized entirely in the movement of goods from place to place, buying low at the source and selling higher at the destination. New financial instruments appear to serve them. Bills of exchange, written promises of payment between parties in different cities, allowed merchants to move value along the river routes without having to physically carry the gold coins that would have made every journey a target for robbery. The river, in other words, did not just move grain and wool and wine. It moved ideas, innovations, and the economic logic that would eventually grow into the market systems that govern our world today. That is a claim that might sound too large, but consider the cities that dominated medieval European commerce. Venice, Bruges, London, Cologne, Hamburg were without exception river cities or cities at the mouths of rivers. The commercial logic of water transport was the engine that drove everything else. And at the center of all of it, managing the practical moment too. Moment reality of whether the barge could make it through the flash lock without losing half its cargo, or whether the current was running too fast today to attempt the upstream bend, or whether the toll at the next bridge was going to make this particular load of wool no longer profitable, was the river merchant himself. And this brings us to something that I find genuinely ironic about the story we have been telling. The merchant who made these river journeys, who understood the water and the economics and the logistics with the kind of expertise that can only come from years of practice, came into direct and sustained conflict with two people we have already met on this very river. The fisherman who needed the river clear of obstructions, and the miller who needed it dammed and controlled. The fishes that gave the fisherman his livelihood blocked the merchant's route. The millware that gave the miller his power source slowed the merchant's progress and charged him for the privilege. All three of them were dependent on the same river. All three of them had entirely legitimate claims on it, and none of their claims were compatible with each other. The river had, it turns out, more owners than it could comfortably accommodate. And the people who decided whose claim mattered most and what price could be extracted from everyone trying to use this shared water were the lords who sat in their castles on the cliffs above the current with chains stretched across the river and men with weapons watching every boat that approached. The toll system of the medieval river was the next logical stop on this journey, and it was waiting for us just around the next bend. Picture the year 1251. The Holy Roman Empire has no emperor. The last one died the previous year, and the great princes and archbishops who control the patchwork of territories along the Rhine are watching each other carefully the way you watch someone across a room when you both know the referee has just left. And in that moment of vacancy, something starts to happen along the river. New toll stations appear. Not one or two, dozens. Practically overnight, lords who had no authority to collect tolls begin doing so anyway. Lords who did have authority start raising their rates. And the merchants, the people who loaded their barges in Barcel and prayed they could reach the sea markets at Rotterdam with something left to sell, find themselves passing through a gauntlet that has no end. Now, I want to ask you something before we go further. Have you ever been on a road trip and hit a string of toll booths one after another, each one costing just a little more than you expected? You pay the first one, and it is fine. You pay the second, and you do a small mental calculation. By the fifth, you're gripping the steering wheel and thinking very specific thoughts about whoever designed this system. Multiply that feeling by about 20. Set it on a river in the 13th century with armed men in the towers above you, and you will begin to understand what it felt like to be a merchant on the Rhine. The Rhine in the Middle Ages was the most important commercial waterway in Western Europe. Full stop. More goods passed through it. More wealth traveled along it. More of Europe's daily life depended on its currents than on almost any other single geographic feature of the continent. From the Swiss Alps all the way to the North Sea, the Rhine connected the merchant cities of the south with the great trading ports of the north, carrying wine, wool, salt, grain, timber, copper, cloth, and an astonishing variety of other goods in both directions. And along every mile of that journey, there was someone with their hand out, Historians have documented that over the entire medieval and early modern period, 79 different locations along the Rhine and its tributaries served at one time or another as toll stations. 79 during Karma times, when imperial authority held firm, the number of active stations at any given moment was kept manageable. In the year 1250, there were 12 stations operating on the stretch between Mainz and Cologne alone. 12 stations on one section of one river. Each one represented a stop, a delay, a negotiation, a payment. The standard toll for an average ship in 1241 was 8 small silver coins called denarii. Larger ships paid more, and those tolls were paid in cash or sometimes in specific cargoes: lead, copper, wine, occasionally other things we will not linger on. Then the interregnum began. No emperor, no central authority. And in just 4 years, the number of active toll stations on the Rhine doubled. Some of the men collecting those tolls had legitimate authority. Many did not. The men without authority came to be called in their own time by a term that would survive 8 centuries and travel across an ocean to describe a very different kind of villain entirely: robber barons. The German term was Rebritta, meaning roughly robber knights. And I find it one of those wonderful historical ironies that this phrase, which today Americans often use to describe industrial titans of the 19th century, originally referred to minor German noblemen in chain mail sitting in hilltop castles along the Rhine, stealing from boats. The original robber barons were not titans of capitalism. They were small-time lords with a river view and a chain stretched across the water. That is how they did it. A literal iron chain pulled tight from one bank to the other. A boat that did not stop could not pass. A boat that stopped but refused to pay could be seized, its cargo confiscated, and its crew imprisoned. There are records of merchants simply vanishing into these tower dungeons for weeks. Some robber barons escalated further. They didn't wait for boats to stop. They sailed out on their own vessels and boarded merchant ships in open water, took the cargo and left. In at least some cases, they took the entire ship, and in the most extreme instances, they took the people. Kidnapping was documented. The Queen of Holland herself was kidnapped by the Baron of Riedberg, a detail so extraordinary that I had to read it twice when I first encountered it. Not a merchant, the Queen captured on the river. Now, here's where the story turns in a direction that I genuinely find inspiring, because the medieval response to this chaos is one of the earliest examples in European history of cities banding together in organized collective self-defense. In the year 1254, while the throne of the Holy Roman Empire remained empty and the barons continued their extortion, something happened in the merchant cities along the Rhine. They had a meeting, and then they formed a league. The Rhenish League, officially launched in 1254, brought together a coalition that eventually included around 100 cities and a number of princes and church lords who all shared one practical interest. They needed the river to work. The League moved fast. Over the next 3 years, its forces targeted 4 robber barons specifically. They besieged their castles. They took them. They destroyed them. Between 10 and 12 robber castles were demolished or made inoperable in that period. The League also rescued the Queen of Holland by capturing Rietberg Castle in 1255, an operation partly funded by the City of Worms. The City of Worms paid to rescue a kidnapped queen from a river baron. That sentence genuinely delights me every time. The League eventually fell apart from internal political disagreements, as leagues tend to do, but its methods left a lasting impression. When a real emperor finally arrived, a man named Rudolf of Habsburg, he applied the same logic. He marched to the castle at Seine, which had been a particularly notorious site of river robbery, torched it, and executed the men inside. The message was not subtle. The age of the chain across the river was ending. But here's what I find worth sitting with beyond the drama. Even the legitimate toll system, the one operating exactly as intended with proper imperial authority and documented rates, was strangling trade on the Rhine in ways that benefited almost no one in the long run. And this is a problem that has a name in economics, though the medieval lords who were causing it did not know or care about its theoretical structure. The problem was this: every lord along the river wanted to maximize the income from their section. Every one of them was rational by their own private logic, but each one collecting the maximum toll from every ship, pushing other lords to raise their rates further, until eventually the combined toll burden made certain journeys simply not worth making at all. Goods that should have flowed freely stopped moving. Markets that should have connected fell apart. People who needed things could not get them. Not because the things did not exist, but because the accumulated cost of moving them down the river had become economically ruinous. One historian described the situation with a precision I find almost elegant. The lords had collectively found a way to kill the goose that was laying the golden eggs. Each of them individually convinced he was simply taking his reasonable share. It is a medieval case study in what happens when a shared resource is governed by people who cannot see past their own immediate interests. And if that sounds at all familiar to you in the modern world, I'm not going to say anything more about that. You can fill in that particular blank yourself that by the 14th century the Upper Middle Valley alone had accumulated approximately 60 toll stations along its length. 60. A merchant traveling the whole river from Basel to the sea might encounter, depending on the period, anywhere between 20 and 30 stops requiring payment. The tolls were not uniform. They varied wildly by cargo type, by the size of the vessel, by the time of year by which lord was in residence, and how good a mood his steward was in. Wine paid one rate, salt paid another, grain a third. Luxuries like spices and fine cloth paid the highest rates of all. The tolls were sometimes paid in coins, sometimes in kind, meaning a portion of the actual cargo was handed over the gate. Sometimes, if the record from particular stations are to be believed, in very creative combinations of goods that tell you a great deal about what was moving through medieval Europe's veins. One moment that stops me every time I think about it is the toll castle of Pfalz-Grafenstein, sitting alone on a small island in the middle of the Rhine near the town of Kaub. Built in 1326 and 1327. This castle was specifically exclusively built to collect river tolls, not to defend a city, not to house a garrison of knights, not to control a mountain pass. Its sole purpose was to sit in the middle of the water and stop boats. It housed a garrison of around 20 men at most. Its physical design was a pentagon pointed upstream, like the prow of a ship to break the ice in winter. And the chain that stretched from Falsenstein to the castle on the bank above it, called Gutenfels, created a barrier that no vessel could slip past unnoticed. Ships that refused to stop could be seized. Ships that stopped and could not or would not pay sat anchored in the current while negotiations took place. I think about those negotiations sometimes. A cold morning, the river moving past, 20 soldiers watching from stone walls, a merchant on his barge, calculating for probably the 15th time on this journey whether the profit at the end of the road is still worth the cost of getting there. And what I want to say clearly, because I think it is one of the most interesting things about this whole story, is that the lords collecting these tolls were not simply being cruel for the sake of it. Most of them, in their own framing, were providing something. The toll system, in its original intent, was linked to obligations. Lords who collected river tolls were supposed to maintain the navigability of the river in their section. They were supposed to keep the banks passable, repair flood damage, ensure safe passage for legitimate trade. Some of them did this. Some of them took the money and did absolutely nothing in return. But the principle behind the system was not pure extraction. It was theoretically a transaction. You pass through my territory, you pay me, and I make sure the passage is safe and clear. The problem was that the person on the boat had no real ability to evaluate whether the service was worth the price, because refusing to pay meant sitting in the current with a chain in front of you and armed men above. It was in this one specific sense exactly the same structural problem as the miller. You cannot leave. You cannot negotiate from a position of real freedom. You pay what is asked, or the journey stops. And if enough people along the chain of a river make that same argument simultaneously from their own rational position, the river that should be a highway becomes a maze of tolls from which no one except the individual lords comes away happy. There is a small detail that I love about all of this, and I want to end with it before we move on. When millions of tourists cruise the Rhine today, the most iconic thing they photograph is the castles. Those towers on the hillsides, those ruins along the gorge between Bingon and Koblenz. They look romantic. They look like fairy tales. They look like the kind of place where knights fell in love, and poets composed verses about the river glittering below. And some of them were all of those things. But they were also in their original and primary function toll booths with battlements, tax offices with drawbridges. The most beautiful highway robbery operation in the history of Europe. Every single one of those ruined towers, picturesque against the German sky, marks a spot where a merchant once reached into his purse on a cold morning and paid to keep moving. I think that is worth remembering. The next time you see a photograph of a Rhine castle and feel that dreamy pull toward the pass, just know that the people who are actually there floating below in a loaded barge with 2 more tolls before nightfall probably had a somewhat less romantic view of the scenery. So the river gave, and the river took. It gave the fisherman his livelihood, the miller his power, the merchant his highway, and it gave the lords along the banks their most reliable source of income. But across all of these stories, every single one of them, there was one thing that none of them could control: the river itself. Because no amount of chain or castle or law or toll schedule has ever made a river truly obedient. And coming up in the very next part of our journey, we're going to stand on the bank and watch the water rise. We're going to feel what it meant when a medieval winter arrived and the Rhine locked itself in ice from bank to bank. When the Seine swallowed the lower streets of Paris. When the Danube turned into something that no map had prepared anyone for. The story of medieval floods and river fury is not a footnote. It is one of the most human stories I know, and it is right here waiting just around the next bend. There is a stone sitting on the bed of the Elbe River in the Czech Republic. It has been there hidden below the surface for centuries. You cannot see it when the river is healthy, when the rains have come and the water runs full and generous across the Central European plain. But when the river drops, when drought arrives, and the water shrinks back toward its bones, this stone rises out of the mud and offers itself to whoever is standing on the bank. And carved into its face in German are the words that someone chiseled there in the year 1616, when the river had fallen to a level that terrified the people who depended on it. 5 words. When du missen weiner? If you see me weep. Researchers have traced records on that same stone back as far as the year 147. 600 years of drought warnings buried in a river. That is what I want to talk about tonight. Not the river when it is kind, the river when it is not. We have spent so much of our time together looking at what the rivers gave, the fish in their abundance, the turning wheel of the mill, the highway of commerce moving goods from city to city. And all of that was real, and all of it mattered enormously. But there is a side of the medieval river relationship that is harder to sit with. And I think it is the most revealing part of the whole story, because the rivers gave freely. Yes. And then sometimes without warning they took everything back, or they withdrew so completely that the absence was just as devastating as the excess. The medieval river did not have 2 settings. It had 100, and only a handful of them were comfortable to live beside. Let's start with the cold. Winter along the great rivers of medieval Europe was a season that we wrapped in our insulated homes with our central heating, and our weather apps cannot fully imagine. The Annals of Fuller, a detailed historical chronicle written by monks in the 9th century, described the winter of the year 874 in language that is quiet and factual, and somehow all the more unsettling for it. They record that there was a particularly harsh winter that year, with uninterrupted snowfall from the 1st of November all the way through to the spring equinox. Not a snowfall, uninterrupted snowfall for months. The cold and the lack of firewood meant, as the annals state directly, that not only animals, but truly also many people froze to death. And then the monks add one more line that stops the modern reader cold. The Rhine and the Miel were clogged with ice. 2 rivers, both frozen, solid enough that the ice clogged their entire channels. Now think about what that meant in practical terms for the communities who lived along those rivers. Not just the obvious loss of the water supply, which was genuinely serious. Not just the frozen fishing grounds, which meant a catastrophic gap in the food supply during the longest fast season of the Christian year, but the complete cessation of river transport. Every barge locked in place. Every shipment of grain, of wine, of salt, of firewood suspended. Every miller sitting idle because no water moved to turn his wheel. Every merchant watching his cargo sit in a warehouse. He could not move. The river had not flooded. It had simply stopped. And that stillness in a world that depended on the river's motion for almost everything was its own kind of catastrophe. There is a story from roughly the same period set on the Danube that I find genuinely haunting. A harsh winter had frozen the river there, too, and the result was a famine in the small riverside communities that had no reserves to fall back on. A bishop named Severin learned that a wealthy widow in one of these towns had been hoarding grain, holding it back from her neighbors, apparently waiting for the prices to rise further before she sold. He confronted her publicly. He called her out by name in front of her community, and then According to the account that survived, something remarkable happened. Shortly after her grain was distributed, a fleet of supply boats appeared on the river. Boats that had been frozen in place upriver for many days, held there by the same ice that was strangling the towns downstream, suddenly broke free. The account describes this as miraculous. The prayers of the holy man had loosed the ice, and the boats had come through out of due season. Whether you interpret that as divine intervention or simply as a remarkable coincidence of timing, the detail that stays with me is not the miracle. It is the widow and the grain she hoarded, and the thing that happens to communities when a river stops moving and the food supply buckles. The same generous river that made trade possible, that made towns possible, had this power. When it froze, the community froze with it. And some people in that cold and fear looked at their neighbor's hunger and saw not suffering, but opportunity. The frozen river revealed something about human nature that the flowing river let everyone keep hidden. Now, let us move to the other extreme. Because if the frozen river was a quiet catastrophe, the flood was anything but quiet. Medieval floods were documented across Europe with a frequency that should genuinely humble anyone who thinks of flood disaster as a modern problem. The great rivers, the Rhine, the Seine, the Danube, the Thames, all of them flooded regularly, not every decade, not every generation, regularly. Almost annually in the worst stretches, and certainly within memory of every family that lived within a mile of the water. Historians studying the Danube's flood record from the 14th century onward have found evidence of what they describe as a culture of flood management in the pre-modern urban areas. That phrase has always struck me. Not a culture of flood prevention, a culture of flood management. Because the people living beside these rivers were not naive. They did not build their towns on the riverbank, imagining that they would never flood. They built there knowing the floods would come, and they built in ways that reflected that knowledge. Houses in the most vulnerable areas were raised on natural or artificial high ground. Crops were chosen specifically for their ability to survive wet soil. Animals were grazed in seasonal marshes that were understood to be temporary. In some parts of medieval Italy, particularly along the Po River Valley, communities would actually breach their own riverbanks deliberately during certain seasons, letting in muddy flood water to deposit the rich sediment that made their fields extraordinarily fertile. They were inviting the flood in on their own terms to take advantage of what it brought. That is not passivity. That is a relationship with water so sophisticated and so intimate that it makes our modern attitude of simply trying to keep rivers away from us look almost arrogant by comparison. But managed risk is still risk, and some floods refuse to be managed. The historical records of the twin towns of Krems and Seine in Austria, sitting on the banks of the Danube, give us one of the most detailed medieval pictures of what a serious flood actually meant for a community. Bridge masters in these towns kept accounts going back to the year 1350, recording every flood that damaged the river bridge and the cost and duration of the repairs needed. What those accounts reveal is that flood damage was not an occasional crisis. It was a budget line item, a predictable recurring expense that the town planned for set-aside money for staff people for. The bridge master was essentially a full-time flood damage administrator, and the fact that the role existed, that it was considered a permanent and necessary civic position, tells you everything about how central the flood cycle was to the rhythm of medieval river towns. You ask yourself a question that I think is worth sitting with. How much of your daily routine right now is shaped by a risk you have simply learned to budget for? The medieval river people knew that answer very specifically, and they built their whole communities around it. What strikes me most about the medieval response to river catastrophe is not the engineering. It is the theology. Because when a flood came, when the Rhine rose over its banks and swept through the lower streets of Cologne, when the Danube swallowed the riverside settlements of the Hungarian plain, when the sun climbed over the quays of Paris and turned the streets of the Ile de Lazette into shallow canals, the first instinct of most communities was not to call the bridge master. It was to call the priest. Medieval Christianity had an entirely coherent, internally consistent framework for understanding why rivers misbehaved. The flood was God's judgment, not a metaphor, not a figure of speech, actual divine punishment for collective sin. The image of Noah was everywhere in medieval religious art. The Cathedral of Bourges in France has a full carved depiction of Noah's flood on its front portal. complete with drowning figures reaching upward in the rising water. The original stained glass at charts showed men and animals drowning. And the detail that catches you is not the water. It is the expressions. People stretching toward a salvation that was no longer coming. Medieval communities looked at those images, and they were not looking at ancient history. They were looking at a warning about themselves. The flood could come again. It would come again. And if it did, it was because they deserved it. So what did you do when the river rose? You repented. You organized processions. You walked through the streets carrying the relics of saints, praying collectively, demonstrating your penitence in the most visible and communal way available. In the 5th century, a bishop named Mertuz, in what is now France, organized formal Rogation Day processions, specifically in response to the threat of flooding and natural disaster. Within a generation or two, this practice had spread widely across Christian Europe. Communities enacted collective prayers, marches, and days of penance every year as a prophylactic measure, not just when disaster came, before it came, because you could not afford to wait. What I find genuinely moving about all of this, and also genuinely complicated, is that the theological response and the practical response often ran alongside each other without contradiction. The same town that organized a penitential procession also repaired its levees. The same people who prayed for God to stop the water also built their houses on higher ground. The community of medieval Valencia, for example, when hit by floods in the early 14th century, did not immediately reach for religious explanation. Their city records show that they blamed their own residents first, specifically for throwing trash and refuse into the canals that caused blockages. And they responded by ordering everyone in the city to spend the next 2 days cleaning the waterways. Mandatory civic cleanup as a flood response. It was only later in the 15th century that Valencia's authorities began adding religious processions to their flood management toolkit, which suggests something I find very human about the medieval relationship with the river. When the problem seemed solvable by human action, they solved it by human action. When it seemed beyond human control, they reached for something larger. We do the same thing. We just reach for different larger things. There is one more element of this story I cannot leave without the hunger stones. The ones along the Elbe and the Rhine and the Vzor and the Mosel. We've already heard about the famous one at Dine with its inscription from 1616. But the practice of marking drought stones goes back at least to the 15th century and possibly earlier. What does it mean that people carve those messages? Think about it for a moment. You're living through a terrible drought. The river is low. The boats cannot move. The crops are failing. People are hungry. And someone in the middle of all that suffering decides to pick up a chisel and carve a warning into a stone that will spend most of its life underwater. They are not writing for themselves. They are writing for people they will never meet. For children and grandchildren who will live along the same river in the same danger. They are saying in the most practical and enduring way available to them, this happened. It can happen again. When you see this stone, you are living through what we live through. Do not be surprised. Do not pretend it cannot be. We were here. We are telling you. Weep. There is something in that gesture, that act of carving a warning into stone for an unknown future reader, that feels like the essence of what it meant to live along a medieval river. You cannot control it. You cannot predict it with any real precision. You cannot make it behave, but you could record it. You could warn each other. You could build a community of memory around the river's moods and pass that memory forward through stone and song and chronicle and the carved letters of people who knew that the river would outlast them all. The medieval river was not a backdrop. It was not a resource to be exploited. It was a relationship conducted across generations with an entity that was older and larger and more patient than anything human civilization had yet produced. And living beside it required a particular kind of humility, the kind you cannot fake. But the floods and the freezes were only part of what the river asked of the people who lived beside it. Because there were other people on that water, people who crossed it every day in all weathers, in boats that were smaller and more fragile than you might imagine. People who had to trust themselves and their knowledge of the river to get everyone else from one bank to the other. People without whom the whole network of medieval life simply stopped. The ferrymen are waiting for us, just up ahead. And their story is shorter than you might expect, quieter and somehow more unsettling. Right where the river bends, just before the bank drops away into the gray water, there is usually a man. You might not have noticed him at first. He is not dramatic. He is not a soldier with a sword, or a merchant with a ledger, or a priest with a cross. He's just a man sitting in a small wooden boat watching the current with the particular attentiveness of someone who has read the same river so many times that he no longer has to think about what he is reading. He is the ferryman, and for most of the people who needed to cross a medieval river, he was the only option they had. We spent a good deal of our journey together looking at the big forces of medieval river life. The commerce, the power, the floods, the tolls, the grinding engines of a civilization built on moving water. But tonight, I want to slow all of that down and look at something smaller, more human. The daily unglamorous, occasionally terrifying work of getting people from one side of a river to the other. Because before the bridges came, which were fewer and farther apart than we tend to imagine, and before the roads improved, which they did not really do for centuries, the ferryman was the hinge point of the whole network. He was the man who connected the two halves of the world. And the story of who he was, who owned him, who he served, and what he risked to do his job is one of the quieter stories in the whole history of the medieval river. Quiet but not small. Let me give you a number first because it sets the stage. In Tudor, London, just a little past the medieval period, we've been exploring a survey, counted over 2,000 wherries and other small craft operating on the Thames, 2,000 boats. And the estimate from the same time was that around 3,000 people earned their living directly from working those boats. In a city whose population was somewhere around 200,000, that means roughly 1 in 65 Londoners made their living by rowing other Londoners across or along the river. Think about what that density of water transport means. Every neighborhood of consequence along the Thames had its own set of waterman stairs, those slippery stone descents down to the water where men would gather and call out to passing foot traffic. Oh yes, sculls, oh the cry of the medieval ferryman was the background music of river life, and crossing with one of these men was, depending on the day and the river and the man, either perfectly routine or genuinely terrifying. The Thames in London was a particular beast of a river to navigate. It was tidal, meaning the currents and the water levels shifted dramatically twice a day. A skilled waterman knew the tides the way a musician knows a piece they have played 1,000 times. He knew when to angle upstream and let the current push him across. He knew when to hold and when to go. He knew which sections of the river moved fastest and which were deceptively calm on the surface while pulling hard underneath. He needed to know all of this because the consequences of not knowing were extremely final. Many watermen drowned. The records say it plainly. This was an occupation with a genuine and regular death toll, and beyond drowning, which was the most obvious risk, there was the river itself as a working environment. Cold water, constant exposure, working in all weather through winter freezes and summer storms. Bronchial disease was so common among Thames watermen that it was considered a professional hazard of the trade, the kind of slow, grinding damage to the lungs and chest that came from decades of damp and cold. These were men who were visibly, physically worn down by their work. And yet the trade was passed down through family's father to son generation after generation in the river parishes of the Thames like Bankside and Suffolk. One historical survey found that in certain districts along the south bank of the Thames, watermen made up as much as 40% of the entire working population, not 40% of the men in a particular occupation, 40% of everyone working in those neighborhoods. The river had not just attracted these families, it had absorbed them completely. Now, here's something that I think is genuinely fascinating about the ferryman's world, and it connects back to a theme we have encountered at every stage of this journey along the medieval rivers of Europe. The river crossing was never simply a practical arrangement. It was a legal one across medieval Europe, and this was documented in extraordinary detail along the German rivers Neckar and Main. Historical researchers have examined written sources concerning 241 river crossings from the Middle Ages and later. 241 documented crossings. Each one represented a complex system of rights and duties. The right to operate a ferry at a particular point on the river was not something you simply decided to do. It belonged to someone, usually the lord whose territory the crossing served, and the ferryman himself occupied a peculiar position within that system. He was simultaneously essential to the community, socially marginal within it, and legally entangled in a web of obligations that he mostly did not right and could not change. The ferry crossing, right, was property. It was inherited. It was bought and sold. It was granted as part of larger land arrangements. And the ferryman who actually operated the crossing was often simply the man the Lord employed to perform a service that the Lord owned. One piece of historical research on English ferries from the period between 1272 and 1415 found that ferry valuations, meaning the assessed economic value of the right to operate a particular crossing, range from between 1 and 20 shillings, with some of the most profitable reaching over 13 pounds for the right to row people across a river. That is by any medieval standard significant money, which tells you something very clear about how central these crossings were to the movement of people, goods, and commerce. The river itself was free. The crossing was not. And can I just say, as someone who thinks about this sort of thing perhaps more than is entirely healthy, that there is something philosophically interesting about this arrangement. The water moved without anyone's permission. The fish swam, the current flowed, rain fell, and yet the moment a human being wanted to get from one bank to the other, they entered a system of rights, fees, Lord's permissions, and legal obligations that have been constructed over generations specifically around that need. The medieval river was nature. The medieval river crossing was politics, and the ferryman sitting in his boat between the two banks was the living embodiment of that distinction. He carried people across from the natural world into the social one and back again every single trip. One of the most revealing details about medieval ferrymen comes from London, and it is the kind of detail that historians mention almost in passing, but which catches in my mind every time I encounter it. London Bridge, that famous structure we heard about briefly in an earlier part of our story, was the only fixed crossing over the Thames in central London for centuries. The bridge itself, completed in the year 129, was a remarkable achievement, and we'll spend more time with it shortly. But the water flowing through the bridge's many stone piers created a very specific problem for the watermen. The bridge narrowed the river channel significantly, and when you narrow a river channel, the water that has to pass through it speeds up. The current underneath London Bridge was fast and turbulent, and navigating a small boat through it required considerable skill. The act of rowing through the gap under the bridge arches was called, quite vividly, shooting the bridge, and shooting the bridge could kill you. A number of people drowned attempting it. Cautious passengers, and there were apparently many of them, would get out of the boat on one side of the bridge, walk across it on foot, and rejoin their watermen on the other side. They effectively paid for a partial ferry trip, disembarked in the middle, walked over the obstacle, and then paid for the rest. There is something about that arrangement that I find deeply, warmly human. The technology of the bridge had made the river more convenient in one sense and more dangerous in another. And the practical response was to do both things simultaneously, one by boat and one by foot, until you were safely through the hazardous bit. The Thames ferrymen were also in the medieval imagination associated with something darker than simple transportation, because the Thames did not just divide the city of London from its southern shore. It divided respectable London from Southwark. Southwark on the south bank sat outside the jurisdiction of the mayor of London, which meant that certain activities that were regulated or prohibited within the city's boundaries were considerably more available south of the water. The brothel, for instance, which were numerous and well attended, were located in Suffolk specifically because the legal geography of the river made that arrangement convenient for everyone involved, and the watermen who fed passengers south across the Thames at night found themselves operating in a moral and legal gray zone that the city authorities found deeply uncomfortable. A record from a year 1339 describes two boatmen who were brought before the court of aldermen accused of rowing, as the document puts it, diverse evildoers and disturbers of the king's peace across the Thames at night, to presumably where various kinds of disturbance could be conveniently pursued. The court was not pleased, and the watermen who operated after dark, who knew the river well enough to navigate it without the landmarks that daylight provided, occupied a very specific social position. They were necessary. They were suspected. They were in many cases quite colorful in their language and their personal habits. If the historical accounts of their general demeanor are to be believed, one historical source describes them with evident affection and equally evident exasperation as rough, saucy, and independent. They had their own dialect, a kind of water language that distinguished them from the landlocked population. They formed a caste in the older sociological sense of the word, inheriting their work, their neighborhoods, their social networks, and their relationship to the river as a package from the generation before. And they were fiercely protective of their trade. When proposals arose to build additional bridges over the Thames, the watermen protested loudly and persistently. Every bridge was a threat to their livelihood. Every stone arch over the water represented a crossing that would no longer need a boat. They were not wrong to worry. But beyond all of the legal complexity, beyond the moralizing and the court records and the Lord's rights and the ferry valuations, there is something I want to sit with for a moment before we move on. Because the ferryman's job, stripped of its political and social context, was at its heart a very simple act of trust. You got into a small wooden boat with a stranger on moving water, and you trusted him to bring you across. Not because you knew him personally necessarily, not because you had reviewed his record or his credentials or checked his qualifications, but because the river needed crossing, and he was there, and the boat was there, and the current was there, and there was nothing else to do but trust. That act of placing yourself in someone else's hands, of accepting vulnerability in exchange for movement, is one of the most ancient human transactions there is. And the ferryman, that quiet figure at the margin of the medieval river, performed it dozens of times a day in rain, in cold, in the darkness before dawn when a traveler needed to reach the far bank before the market opened. In the same gray winter weather that froze the river upriver and left the lower Thames still moving, but biting cold under the oars. He was not celebrated. He was not particularly respected. He left almost nothing behind him in the historical record except occasional appearances in court documents, very valuations, and the complaints of the people who found his rates too high or his manner too free. But every person who crossed a medieval river and survived the crossing owed something to whoever held the OES. And when I think about the full picture of medieval river life that we've been building together over these past hours, from the fisherman at dawn to the miller grinding grain to the merchant counting tolls, to the ferrymen waiting at the stairs in the half-light, I keep coming back to the same thought. The river did not do any of this alone. The river gave the opportunity. But the people, with all their ingenuity and their greed and their courage and their faith and their rough, independent humor, are the ones who build a civilization around it. Now, there is one more kind of person who stood beside these rivers throughout the medieval period. A person who did not fish them, or mill them, or tax them, or cross them. A person who looked at the water and heard something in it that was not commerce or danger or practical utility. Something older, something that the church was built on top of but never quite managed to replace. The sacred river is waiting for us just ahead, and I think you will find as we step toward it that this part of the story reaches further back than any other. Long before the first stone church was built beside a European river, before any priest carried a candle to the water's edge to bless it, before baptism became the sacrament that made a person human. In the eyes of the medieval world, the rivers already had gods. They had had them for a very long time. And tonight, as we settle into perhaps the most layered part of our whole journey together, I want to take you somewhere that most history books glance at and then move quickly past. To the moment when Christianity arrived at the river's edge, looked down at what was already there, and had to decide what to do about it. The sun has a name. Most people know it as a river, a famous one. The river that runs through Paris that carries pleasure boats and reflections of the Eiffel Tower and the dreams of every romantic who has ever stood on one of its bridges. But the name Seine is not French. It is not even Roman. It is Celtic, and it is very old, and it is the name of a goddess. Her name was Swana, and the story of Swana is one of the most extraordinary continuities in the entire history of European spiritual life. The Celts who inhabited the lands that would eventually become France, Britain, and much of Central Europe before the Roman conquest understood the rivers in a way that was entirely different from how we think about them now. They did not think of a river as a body of water. They thought of it as a being, a living entity with personality, with power, with preferences, and with the ability to give or withhold its gifts depending on how well you treated it. Swana was the divine personification of the Seine, not a metaphor, not a poetic figure of speech, an actual goddess who inhabited the waters and could be approached, petitioned, and thanked. At the headquarters of the sun on a plateau, in what is now Burgundy, roughly 300 kilometers from Paris, the Celts built a sanctuary to Swana. And when archaeologists excavated the site across multiple seasons of work from the 19th century through the 20th, They found something that genuinely moved me when I first read about it. They found 1,500 ancient objects, hundreds of votive offerings, stone carvings of body parts, eyes, legs, arms, internal organs, heads, each one representing an ailment and injury, a suffering that a pilgrim had brought to the goddess and laid before her water, asking to be healed. They found a bronze statue of the goddess herself, elegant and serene, standing on a duck-headed boat, a detail that speaks to the river's navigable nature and to a time when boats and water were one continuous sacred reality. And they found coins, hundreds of coins thrown into the water across centuries by people who wanted something or who were grateful for something they had received. That gesture, the gesture of throwing something of value into moving water as an offering to whatever lives in it, is one of the oldest human impulses that exists. You still do it at a fountain, at a wishing well, without thinking about it very hard. Now, here's the thing that I find endlessly fascinating about all of this, and it is the detail that changes the whole shape of the story. When the Romans arrived and conquered Gaul, they did not destroy the cult of Seine. They absorbed it. They built a larger, grander sanctuary complex at the source of the Seine. They dedicated inscriptions to Seine alongside their own gods. And when Christianity eventually arrived and the old religions were officially forbidden, Seine did not disappear either. She went underground. The word underground is almost literal here. The water that had been sacred to Seine kept flowing. The people who had always brought offerings to the river's source kept coming. And over time, the church did what it had done so effectively across Europe in so many situations. It did not fight the existing devotion. It redirected it. The sacred spring near Dijon, where Seine was worshipped, became a site associated with Christian blessing. The impulse to come to the water for healing, for intercession, for spiritual renewal, simply found a new name to attach itself to. This pattern played out along almost every major river in Europe. The Rhine had its own deity. Rhenus Pita, the father of the Rhine, was depicted by the Romans and those who came before them as a powerful figure with two horns, one for each of the river's great branches where it splits into the well on its way to the sea. The Roman poet Marcus Valerius Marialis called Rheus the father of nymphs and rivers. Coins were struck bearing his image. Altar stones were raised along the river's banks, and the Danube had Danuvius, a river god important enough to appear in inscriptions throughout the Roman Empire. The river man was personified by the goddess Matrona, meaning essentially the mother river. The river wharf in Britain had Verba. The Celtic cultures of Britain and the continent named their rivers with feminine names wherever possible because they understood rivers as nurturers, as mothers, as the sources of life in the most literal sense. Do you see what is happening here? The very rivers we've been following through this whole series, the Rhine, the Seine, the Danube, the rivers that built medieval civilizations, commerce and power in daily life, were at their root understood as divine, not metaphorically divine, actually concretely, personally divine, each with a name, each with a face, each capable of being in a relationship with the human beings who live beside them. And now Christianity arrives, and the church faces a genuinely difficult problem. You cannot simply tell people that the river they have been praying to for 1,000 years is not sacred. The river is right there. It is still flowing. It is still giving fish and water and power and passage. It is still dangerous. It still floods. It still freezes. It still takes lives. The evidence of its power is immediate and constant. What the church could do, and what it did with remarkable strategic intelligence across medieval Europe, was to take the sacredness of the river and give it a new theological framework. Water did not lose its holiness in the Christian imagination. It gained it. Baptism, the central initiation rite of the Christian faith, was performed in water. Jesus himself was baptized in the River Jordan. The early church carried out baptisms in actual rivers and streams not as a mere symbol, but as a continuation of the understanding that moving water was the proper medium for spiritual transformation. In medieval Sweden, baptismal fonts were understood to simultaneously represent the River Jordan and the rock hewn tomb for which Christ rose. The font was placed at the entrance of the church because the unbaptized person stood at the threshold between the Christian world and the world outside it, and water was the crossing point. Every medieval baby who was baptized in that font was in the theological imagination of the time, being carried from one kind of world into another across the water. As every ferryman had always done, the metaphor was not invented. It was borrowed from something much older. But here is the genuinely remarkable thing, and the thing that I think speaks most clearly about human beings and how we hold our beliefs. The old offerings did not stop. Under the surface of medieval Christian life along Europe's rivers, the ancient gestures persisted. People still threw coins into the water, not at the baptismal font, at the river itself. They still whispered to the water. They still left small gifts on the banks. They still told stories about what lived in the depths. Stories about water spirits and nixies and river creatures who could be appeased or angered. Stories that had the same emotional structure as the old Celtic beliefs about divine entities inhabiting the water. The Rhine had its Lorelei, the figure of a woman on the great rock who lured sailors to their fate with her singing. The legend, as it came down in German folklore, had been filtered through many layers of telling by the time it reached its most famous form. But at its heart was something very old. The idea that the river was alive, that it wanted something, that you could be drawn into it if you forgot to be careful. And in Britain, several rivers had rhymes attached to them that described them as demanding an annual payment in human lives. A medieval rhyme about the River Dawn said the shelving, slimy River Dun would claim a daughter or a son every year. The historian who recorded it in the 19th century thought the rhyme might have referred back to ancient times when actual offerings were made to the river god. Whether that is true or not, the emotional content of the rhyme is clear. The river was an entity with needs, an entity that would take what it needed if you did not give it willingly. I find myself wanting to be careful here, because I do not want to present this in a way that is dismissive of anyone's beliefs, ancient or modern. What strikes me about the long continuity of river reverence across European history is not superstition. It is perception. The people who gave the sun a goddess were paying attention to the river in a way that we rarely do. They noticed that it gave. They noticed that it took. They understood in the way that you can only understand something that you depend on entirely, that the river was not indifferent to human life. Whether it was because a divine personality inhabited it, or because of the complex ecological and hydrological processes we would now describe with scientific vocabulary. The river's relationship with the people who lived beside it was real, and it was reciprocal, and it had consequences. Seine did not disappear when Christianity arrived. She was renamed. The same spring that had been her sanctuary became a place where people came seeking Christian healing. Same water, same impulse, different name above the door. And along every river in medieval Europe, this same process played out in 100 variations. Churches were built beside rivers specifically because rivers had always been sacred. Christian missionaries built their foundations at the ends of ancient causeways that crossed river valleys, mirroring and extending the pre-Christian ritual topography that was already there. The monks who chose river sites for their abbeys were not simply being practical about water supply. They were inheriting a tradition of understanding those sites as places where the boundary between the ordinary world and something larger was thin. There is a detail from the excavation at the source of the Seine that has stayed with me since I first encountered it. Among the offerings found at Swane's sanctuary, there were votive objects depicting body parts, as we have discussed. But among them, there was also something else. There were small stone carvings of pilgrims, not of gods or goddesses, just people. People in the act of walking, people carrying offerings in their hands, people on their way to the water, and historians have been able to identify from inscriptions near these figures some of the social roles of the visitors. There was a slave. There were several women. There were people identified as pilgrims. There was a male citizen. People who, by the social rules of their time, had almost nothing in common with each other. The slave and the citizen, the woman and the man. They came to the same river. They stood at the same bank. They held out whatever small thing they brought with them. And they asked for the same things: healing, mercy, another chance. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and the conclusion I keep coming back to is this. The sacred river is the river stripped of all its economic and political meaning. Not the river of the fisherman's rights. Not the river of the toll collector's demands. Not the river of the miller's power or the merchant's profit or the lord's jurisdiction. The sacred river is the river that remains when all of that falls away. The river that was there before any of it. The river that will be there after all of it. The river that when you stand beside it and look down at the moving water reminds you quietly but unmistakably that you are not in fact in charge. The medieval person standing at the Rhine or the Seine or the Danube and throwing a coin into the current was doing something that the fisherman and the miller and the merchant could not do. They were simply giving, not trading, not demanding, not taxing, not claiming rights. Just giving something back to the water, acknowledging in the most ancient human gesture available that the river had given first. And with that quiet acknowledgement still hanging in the air between us, we have one more threshold to cross before this journey reaches its end. Because the rivers did not only shape belief, they shaped stone. And the bridges, those extraordinary medieval achievements that we have glimpsed throughout our story, deserve a moment of their own. Because a bridge over a sacred river was not just engineering. It was a negotiation with everything we have just been talking about. And the stories people told about who paid for those bridges and what was required to make them stand will give you something to think about long after tonight's story is over. Somewhere in medieval France, a 12-year-old shepherd boy is standing in a field on the slopes of the Ardèche Mountains. It is the year 1177. He is watching his sheep, and then he hears a voice. The voice tells him to go down to the city of Avignon to stand before the people and to build a bridge across the Rhine. The Rhine, one of the most powerful, most difficult, most punishing rivers in France. A river where, as the boy will later explain to the skeptical bishop of Avignon, even the Roman engineers of antiquity had given up trying to bridge it at this point. Now, you might think the shepherd boy simply went home at his supper and had a lie down. That would have been the sensible choice, but he did not do the sensible thing. He walked down from the mountains. He went to the cathedral. He interrupted the bishop's sermon. And when the bishop challenged him to prove his divine commission, the 12-year-old bent down, lifted a block of stone that, by all accounts 30 grown men could not have moved, and threw it into the river, where it would serve as the foundation for the first pier. The bridge was built, all 900 m of it, 22 arches crossing the Aar, the only fixed river crossing between Lyon and the Mediterranean Sea. And the boy who started it all died of exhaustion at roughly 19 years old, for years before the bridge was completed. He was buried inside a chapel built on one of the bridge's piers. His body was still there inside the stone of the bridge itself, while the people of Avignon crossed over and danced below in the river meadows. There is something about medieval bridges that I keep coming back to, something that took me a long time to fully articulate. And it is this. Every bridge was in the medieval imagination a kind of miracle. Not because medieval people were credulous, but because they understood in the most visceral way possible exactly how difficult a bridge was to build. They had seen rivers eat structures whole. They had watched piers collapse and arches fall. They had lived beside water long enough to know what it could do to stone and wood and mortar when it decided it had been patient long enough. And so, when a bridge stood, when it actually held against the floods and the ice and the years and the weight of the carts and the livestock and the thousands of feet crossing it every single day, the natural human response was to ask, how? How could this possibly be strong enough? And the answers that people gave to that question are some of the most revealing things I know about the medieval mind. There are scattered across Europe dozens of bridges that carry the same name, the Devil's Bridge. They are found in Wales, in Italy, in Switzerland, in Germany, in Spain, in France, in almost every country that had rivers too difficult to cross and bridges that seemed too extraordinary to have been built by ordinary human hands. And each one carries a variant of the same story. The builder, facing an impossible task, made a deal. The devil would help build the bridge. In exchange, he wanted the soul of the first living creature to cross it. The deal was struck. The bridge went up, and then at the crucial moment the builder cheated. At the bridge over the Sirio River in Tuscany, Italy, a dog was lured across first. At a bridge in Cardigans in Wales, an old woman threw a piece of bread, and her dog chased it over before anyone else could step onto the stone. At the Sachsenhauser Bridge in Frankfurt, a builder drove a rooster across. The devil in each version was furious, and in the Italian story, his fury had permanent architectural consequences. 2 holes in the bridge that have never since been filled. Now, why does this matter? Why do so many different communities across so many different countries across so many centuries, converge on the same basic story. Some scholars have pointed to the idea of foundation sacrifice, the very ancient practice of burying a body, usually in animals but sometimes human, in the foundation of an important structure to appease the spirits of the ground and ensure the building would stand. Evidence of such practices has been found near the foundations of buildings and bridges across Europe. The Encyclopedia of Superstitions notes specifically that it was considered very unlucky to be the first person to cross a new bridge. The same reluctance, the same understanding that the bridge had a cost, and that someone had to pay it appears in nursery rhymes. And some scholars have suggested that the famous London Bridge nursery rhyme, with its refrain about falling down and building it back up again, contains traces of exactly this very old belief about what a bridge required to stand. But the medieval response to that old belief was characteristically to transform it, not to abandon the idea that building a bridge required something sacred, but to redirect that need towards something Christian. In the late 12th century, when the Pont and Benz was being built at Avignon, the people who wanted to support it formed an organization. They called themselves the Bridge-Building Brotherhood, the Fratres Pontifices in Latin, and they understood their work explicitly as a religious calling. Building a bridge was in their framing a work of charity, of piety, of service to God and to pilgrims and travelers. The Archbishop of York, a historical record shows, granted official indulgences to those who contributed money or labor to bridge construction in the 13th century. Indulgences, the same spiritual currency that was granted for pilgrimage to holy sites for charitable works, for prayers. Building a bridge could literally reduce your time in purgatory, which meant that a medieval person contributing a day's labor to help repair a bridge was not doing civic maintenance. They were making a spiritual deposit. The bridge was sacred infrastructure. London Bridge, completed in the year 129 after 33 years of construction, embodied this understanding more completely than almost any other structure in medieval England. The bridge was begun under the supervision of a priest named Peter of Colchurch, who did not simply oversee the engineering. He built a chapel into the bridge itself. Right there on the largest pier in the middle of the structure, the chapel of St. Thomas the Martyr stood not as an afterthought, as a foundation element. The chapel was dedicated to Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who'd been murdered in 1170, whose death had been ordered, however obliquely, by King Henry II himself. The king and Penance commissioned the bridge. The bridge in return became a pilgrimage site. Historians have recovered hundreds of medieval pilgrim badges from the riverbed around where the middle pier once stood the small metal souvenirs that pilgrims collected at holy sites as proof of their journey. They were dropping into the water at London Bridge, not because the bridge was a shrine exactly, but because they were standing on something sacred, something built at the intersection of royal guilt, divine mercy, architectural ambition, and the ancient human instinct to make offerings to the water below. And London Bridge was not just a crossing. It was a city. By the 14th century, the bridge was home to approximately 500 people living in the 140 houses that had been built along its length. 500 people living on a bridge. 2 carts could barely pass each other on the roadway. The houses jutted out over the water on both sides, some of them projecting so far out that they nearly touched across the gap, creating a shadowy tunnel over the road below. There were shops, there were inns, there were water mills built into some of the gaps between piers, grinding grain in exactly the same way that river mills worked everywhere else. Except here, the machinery hung suspended over the Thames rather than sitting beside it. And at the southern end of the bridge, on the gates and towers, there were the heads, the severed heads of traitors, preserved in tar and impaled on wooden poles, displayed as warnings to anyone entering the city from the south. William Wallace was there. Thomas More was there. What? Tyler was there. The bridge was simultaneously a miracle of engineering, a residential neighborhood, a pilgrimage landmark, a market street, a mill, and an execution memorial, all at once, all in the same 280 m of stone over moving water. If that does not make you marvel at the density of medieval life, I'm not sure what will. And here is the detail about London Bridge that I think is the most extraordinary of all. The bridge was completed in 129. It was demolished in the 1830s. That is 620 years, 6 centuries. The same bridge through plague and fire and war and revolution and the entire transformation of England from a medieval kingdom to an industrial empire. Think about that. Every single English person born in those 6¼ centuries walked across the same structure if they crossed the Thames in London. Chaucer crossed it. Shakespeare crossed it. Elizabeth I crossed it. Samuel Pepys crossed it. The night before the Great Fire of London began on Pudding Lane, just off the northern end of the bridge. That fire burned everything around the bridge, but could not cross it because a previous fire in 1633 had already destroyed a section near the northern end, creating a gap that acted entirely accidentally as a fire break. The bridge that was burned saved the city from being burned again. Something I think about, and I want to share it with you, because it is the kind of thought that appears quietly and then will not leave, is this. Medieval bridges were almost never permanent in the way we think of infrastructure as permanent. They needed constant repair. They flooded. They froze. They were damaged by boats and by wars, and by the simple, relentless pressure of water against stone. The record of the Danube bridges in Austria shows bridge masters repairing flood damage almost annually. London Bridge itself collapsed twice in its 600 years of existence. Once in 1281 and again in 1437, and yet people kept rebuilding them. That to me is the real meaning of the medieval bridge. Not the engineering, though the engineering was extraordinary, but the persistence, the decision made over and over and over again that the connection was worth the cost, that what lay on the other side was worth building toward, that the river dividing us was not the final word on whether we could reach each other. What do you build toward? What keeps calling you to cross a difficult stretch of water, even knowing it will cost something, even knowing the current underneath is stronger than it looks? I think about the shepherd boy from the Ardèche. Every time I ask myself that question, 12 years old, standing in a field, hearing something that told him to go and build and going. Not because it was easy, not because the river was kind, but because the other side was there visible from the bank, waiting for the stone and the mortar and the years of work and the lives of the people willing to lay them. And speaking of lives laid alongside rivers, there is one more story waiting for us on these banks. A story about the women who lived closest to the water, who washed clothes in it, who gathered medicine from its edges, who were sometimes blamed for its power, and sometimes thanked for their knowledge of it. The women by the medieval river have been quiet throughout our journey, present in the corners of the frame, and it is time to bring them fully into the light. Every morning before the fishermen got to the river, and before the millers opened their slee gates and long before the merchants loaded their barges, there was already someone at the water. She was not fishing. She was not collecting a toll. She was not building anything or measuring anything or writing anything down in a ledger. She was kneeling at the bank, her hands in the cold water working, and she had probably been there since before dawn, the same as every morning, the same as her mother before her, and her mother's mother before that. She was theirs, and her relationship with the medieval river was the oldest, the most intimate, and in some ways the most dangerous one of all. It is one of the quiet dishonesties of medieval history that the women who worked the rivers most directly are the ones who left the least trace in the written record. The lords who taxed the river wrote documents. The merchants who shipped goods wrote accounts. The priests who blessed the water wrote sermons. But the women who washed the clothes, who gathered the riverbank plants, who delivered babies with hands they had first rinsed in the current, who knew where the rushes grew and what the water smelled like before a flood, who understood the river's moods in a way that was less about observation and more about something older. The kind of knowing that comes from a lifetime of daily contact. They did not write it down. We find them mostly in the margins. A payment to a washerwoman here. A complaint about laundresses gathering at a particular spot there. A legal case. A name in a court record. A word or two in someone else's story. But those fragments, when you assemble them, tell a story that is worth every bit of our attention tonight. Let us begin with the work itself, because the work was extraordinary. Laundering clothes in the Middle Ages was not the kind of light domestic task that the modern imagination might picture. It was a full-body physical labor. Medieval soap was made from animal fat mixed with lye, a caustic alkaline substance produced by leaching water through wood ash. The soap was powerful enough to strip stains from linen. It was also powerful enough to strip the skin from hands. Women who did this work every day, day after day, developed chronically cracked and damaged skin calluses that never fully healed, and a particular kind of worn and reamed hands that were recognizable as the mark of the trade. The linen itself was heavy. Soaked cloth weighs considerably more than dry cloth. Carrying it to the river, working in the water, wringing it out, carrying it back to dry. Doing this repeatedly for the entire community's washing was work that required genuine physical strength. Medieval advice books, in a detail that I find unexpectedly touching, recommended that underwear be changed every single day, which means someone had to wash it every single day, that someone was almost always a woman. Along the Thames in London, there was a dedicated structure for exactly this work. Historical records mention it by name: La Lavender Break. The Laundress Bridge, a wooden jetty, a platform jutting out over the water, specifically designed and designated for the city's washerwomen to do their work. Think about what it means that such a thing existed. The city recognized in a formal and architectural way that a specific kind of work was happening at the river, and that work was women's work, and it needed its own infrastructure. And yet those same women, despite their dedicated bridge and their essential service, occupied one of the lowest rungs on the social ladder of the medieval city. A historian studying medieval lorises across England and northern France in the period between approximately 1300 to 1550 found something fascinating. The responses Tauruses were, as she puts it, highly ambivalent. They were recognized as necessary. They were often treated as suspect. The freedom of movement that the job required, traveling between households working at the riverbank in a semi-public space existing at the margins of the domestic world, made loresses objects of both social utility and social unease. But I want to stop here for a moment and complicate that picture, because the stereotype of Varys as a helpless victim of medieval society, a woman crushed by her circumstances, does not hold up entirely when you look more carefully at the evidence. Historians studying medieval Poland, for example, found that washerwomen were employed by a remarkably wide cross-section of society, including students at universities, members of the clergy, and the royal court itself. The accounts of a Polish royal household show a dedicated laundry facility equipped with wooden tubs and staffed by women who lived on the castle grounds. These were not marginal figures in that context. They were permanent housed members of the royal staff, and the riverbank, wherever it was, functioned as something that a historian described beautifully as a female space par excellence. A place where women gathered not under the supervision of husbands or employers, not in the confines of a domestic interior, but out in the open beside running water, working together. News was exchanged there. Advice was given. Grievances were aired. Women who had no other public space in the medieval city had the riverbank, and the washing was done, and the community kept its linen clean. And no one in the historical record thought to write down that these women had built something together at the water's edge, something like a community, a little removed from the main current of power, but no less real for that. Now, alongside the laundresses, there was another group of women at the medieval river, and their relationship to the water was not about labor exactly. It was about knowledge. Medieval Europe's rivers were medicine cabinets, the plants that grew along river banks, the roots and herbs that thrived in marshy ground, the bark of trees that stood at the water's edge. All of these were part of a body of practical botanical knowledge that was accumulated, tested, and passed down primarily by women. Hildegard of Bingen, the remarkable 12th century abbess and scholar, documented hundreds of medicinal herbs in her great works on natural medicine. She was exceptional in being able to write it all down and in having the institutional position that let her work be preserved. But the knowledge she documented was not hers alone. It was the common property of women across Europe who'd been tending the sick with plants since long before anyone thought to organize it into a written text. And a significant portion of that herbal knowledge was specifically riverine plants like water mint meadow sweet, growing in wet ground along river margins. The various rushes and sedges and willow bark that medieval healers used. These were gathered by women who knew where to find them, when to pick them, how to prepare them, and what they were good for. Women who lived closest to the rivers had access to this knowledge first. But here's where the story darkens. Because in a world that did not fully understand why some medicines worked and others did not, the line between healer and something more threatening was uncomfortably thin. A woman who knew how to cure a fever with river plants was valuable. A woman who knew how to cure a fever with river plants, and whose neighbor's cow had died last week, was something else entirely. The judicium aqua frigid, the judgment of cold water, the ordeal of the river as a legal test. Water ordeal, the practice of immersing accused persons in a river or pond to determine guilt or innocence, had ancient roots that stretch back far beyond medieval Europe. The Code of Hammurabi from ancient Mesopotamia includes provisions for river ordeal. In England, it appears in the laws of King Æthelstan from the late 9th and early 10th centuries, and in the laws that followed under King Arthur and under William the Conqueror. The logic was this: water was the element of baptism. Water was sacred. Therefore, water could be trusted to reveal the truth when other forms of evidence failed. An innocent person, it were held, would be accepted by the water. They would sink. A guilty person, one who had rejected the sacred, would be rejected by the water. They would float. And now think about how perfectly, how viciously that logic worked against the women we've been describing. Women who worked the river every day. Women who gathered plants from its banks. Women who had, in the eyes of some, a relationship with the water that was too intimate, too knowing, too comfortable. If the river knew you, perhaps that was the problem. I want to be precise about something here because the history of this practice is often misunderstood. The water ordeal in its medieval legal form was used for all kinds of accused persons, not exclusively women, and not exclusively for witchcraft accusations. Over 20 instances appear in the official records of the Assay of Clarendon in 1166. They were recorded calmly as legal procedure. The ordeal was administered by clergy with formal liturgical rites and the blessing of the elements. It was in its medieval framing genuinely understood as a method of obtaining divine judgment. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, under Pope Innocent III, officially prohibited clergy from participating in orals, and the practice declined substantially in its formal legal manifestation after that. But the underlying idea, the logic that the river had the power to tell you the truth about a person, that water had a kind of moral intelligence, did not disappear. It went underground, and it came back with concentrated viciousness in the early modern period, directed primarily at women, and primarily at women who had already been identified as problematic by their communities. By 1717, an official case in Leicester recorded 2 women who, when subjected to the swimming test, floated like a cork, a piece of paper, or an empty barrel, though they strove all they could to sink. One historian studying these practices makes an observation that I find genuinely important and worth sharing. The swimming test, he argues, gave a community jury a way to make official a verdict they had already privately reached. Human bodies in water tend toward a kind of ambiguous buoyancy. Everyone floats a little. Everyone sinks a little. Whether you were judged to have sunk enough to be innocent depended very much on who was watching and what they had already decided about you. The river did not judge. The community judged, and the river simply provided the theater. That observation sits with me more heavily than almost anything else I've researched for this series, because it tells you something about what the river meant to the medieval world that is deeply and disturbingly human. The same water that gave theirs her livelihood. The same water that gave the healer her medicine. The same water that carried the prayers of the penitent and the offerings of the faithful could become the instrument by which a community turned on one of its own. The river did not care about that. It flowed. It went on flowing. The same current that had been running since before the first human being stood on its bank would run long after the last one was gone. What changed was not the river. What changed was what people brought to its edge. And I think about the women who went to the river every morning with their heavy baskets and their cracked hands, who knew every stone in the ford, who had their own section of the bank, their own unwritten understanding with the water, who talked to each other at the washing place in ways they could not talk anywhere else, who knew the plants and the currents and the seasons better than anyone with authority to write those things down. They were not historians. They were not saints. They were not victims. Most of them, most of the time, they were workers. They were neighbors. They were keepers of knowledge. And their relationship with the medieval river was as deep and as complicated and as real as anyone else's. Maybe deeper, maybe more complicated, maybe more real. We're almost at the end of our journey now. We've walked the whole length of the medieval river together. From the fisherman in the mist before dawn to the toll collector in his castle above the gorge. From the millstone grinding in the night to the coins sinking through sacred water. From the flooding that swallowed whole villages to the bridges that people rebuilt over and over, believing the connection was worth the cost. And now, at the very end of this long walk beside the water, there is one more thing left to do. We need to stop at the bank to look at the river one last time and ask what all of this means. What does it leave us with this long look at the people who lived beside the great rivers of medieval Europe? What does the river finally remember? That part of our story is right here. The river does not keep time the way we do. It does not mark anniversaries. It does not remember the name of the fishermen who stood in it at dawn 1,000 years ago. It does not grieve for theirs whose hands cracked in its cold water. It does not congratulate itself on the cities it helped build, or mourn the ones that burned and were rebuilt beside it. It simply flows, and that, I think, is the most important thing about it. The river was there before the first medieval stone was laid. It will be there after everything we call modern has run its course. But in between, in that particular stretch of human centuries we call the Middle Ages, something happened along those banks that deserves to be seen whole from beginning to end in the full complexity of everything it contained. And tonight, right now, together we have done that. Look at what we've covered. We started at the very beginning at the question of why every great city of medieval Europe was built on a riverbank. And the answer turned out to be not one thing, but many things at once. Water, food, defense, transport, connection, identity. The river was not a backdrop. It was the reason. We met the fishermen who knew their section of water the way a musician knows a piece by heart, who fought legal battles over we and claimed in their petitions that without them the city of London went hungry on fast days. And they were right. We spent time with the millers, those indispensable and deeply resented men who ground the grain that everyone depended on, and who occupied that peculiar social position of being both essential and suspect, trusted with the food supply and accused of stealing from it simultaneously. We traveled the merchant highways, those extraordinary water roads that moved goods 30 times more cheaply than overland. And we counted the toll stations along the Rhine, 79 of them across 1,000 years, until the accumulation became absurd, even by the standards of medieval governance. We watched the bridges go up. We heard the stories people told about what it cost to build them. And we felt somewhere beneath those stories the very ancient understanding that crossing a river is never free. That it always asks something of you, whether that something is a coin or a prayer or a piece of your courage. We stood in the floods. We felt the ice. We read the hunger stones carved by people who knew the river would take everything if it decided to, and who wanted to leave a warning for people they would never meet. If you see me weep. We sat with the ferrymen, those rough, independent, water dialect speaking men who made their living in the liminal space between one bank and the other, who knew the tides better than the almanac, who were both essential and suspect, just like the millers, just like the washerwomen, just like everyone who stood too close to the river's real power. We followed the water all the way to its oldest meaning, to the goddess who gave the Seine her name, to the deity whose two horns marked the splitting Rhine, to the long continuity of human reverence for rivers that Christianity absorbed but never quite replaced. And we stood at the banks with the women, knees cold and the current hands already red from the lye soap, doing the work that kept everyone else clean, while the world's records were written mostly by the people whose linen they were washing. Here is what I have come to believe, having spent all this time beside these rivers. The medieval world understood something about water that we have mostly lost. Not technically, not scientifically. We know far more about hydrology and fluid dynamics and watershed management than any medieval person ever could. But in terms of relationship, in terms of the daily lived embodied understanding of what a river is and what it means and what it asks of you, the people who lived beside the Thames in 1200 had something we do not. They cannot take the river for granted. They cannot turn a tap. They could not check the flood warning app before deciding whether to build on the low ground. The river was always present, always active, always capable of changing everything. And so they paid attention to it in a way that we, insulated by infrastructure and technology, rarely manage. A scholar named Ellen Arnold, writing about medieval river cultures for Cambridge University Press, describes how medieval communities used rivers not just as practical resources, but as vehicles for understanding themselves, their place in history, and their hopes for the future. The river, she argues, provided a unique opportunity to think about change and transition, about the connections between past and present, about what endures and what flows away. And she is right. A river is the most perfect metaphor for time that nature has ever produced. It moves constantly. It is never the same water twice. And yet it is recognizably the same river year after year, century after century, shaped by the same banks running toward the same sea. Herodotus said, "You cannot step in the same river twice." He was right. But the medieval fisherman who stepped into the Thames every morning of his working life would have laughed at that. Of course, it was the same river. He knew every bend of it. He had named every current. He had inherited his stretch of water from his father and would leave it to his son. The sameness and the change were not contradictions to him. They were just a river. What remains then from all of this? What do the rivers leave us? Paris still stands on the Ile d'Isset, cradled by the sun, in almost exactly the position that the first galaxy settlers chose, because the water protected them on all sides. London still sprawls across the Thames, the same river that carried Roman goods and Saxon prayers, and Viking raids, and medieval grain, and Tudor pageantry, and the smoke of the Great Fire, and the pride of an empire. Cologne still rises above the Rhine, whose castles and ruins the tourists photograph every summer, without always knowing that they are looking at the ruins of toll booths. Vienna still looks out over the Danube, that great connector of east and west, that river so important that 4 capital cities grew on its banks. And the Romans made it the northern wall of their empire. The bridges are still there. Different bridges now in most cases, newer stone, newer steel, but at the same crossing points on the same rivers where medieval engineers drove their wooden piles into the same riverbeds and prayed that the water would hold. The rivers did not go anywhere. The cities that grew beside them did not go anywhere. The relationship between human beings and flowing water did not end with the Middle Ages. It is still happening right now. Every city that has ever mattered has a river. The question is always the same. Will you build beside it? Will you honor it? Will you remember what it is? I want to end tonight with a thought that has stayed with me since the very beginning of this journey, since I first started thinking about what it meant to live beside a great river in medieval Europe. The fisherman at dawn, the miller before the wheel began to turn, the merchant counting his remaining coins after the third toll of the morning, the ferryman reading the current with his eyes before committing his weight to the oar, the woman at the riverbank working in the cold, keeping everyone else's world clean, the child who dropped a coin into the water and watched it flash and disappear, the monk who blessed the river each spring, asking it somehow to be merciful. None of these people thought of themselves as history. They were not performing for a future audience. They were just living beside a river trying to make it through the week. And yet here we are centuries later, still able to hear them in the court records, in the Doomsday Book, in the Hunger Stones, in the legal cases, in the saints' lives, and the merchant accounts, and the occasional explosive petition about fishes in the Magna Carta, in the names of rivers that are still the names of ancient goddesses, in the children's song about the bridge that kept falling down and being rebuilt, in the wishing well where you still throw a coin without thinking about it very much, because something in you knows that the water deserves something. They're still there. The river carries them. So the next time you stand on a bridge and look down at moving water, or the next time you drive through a city and see a river glinting between the buildings, or the next time you reach a river's edge on a walk somewhere, and just stand there for a moment watching the current run, take a second, think about who stood in that spot before you. Not one person, hundreds of generations of people, each of them living out the same essential relationship with the same essential fact. The water moves, life happens beside it, and then the water moves on. We have reached the end of our journey along the great rivers of medieval Europe. All 12 parts, all those hours together in the dark beside the water. And I want to say something before we part for the night, something that I mean genuinely and not just as a formality. Thank you. Thank you for your curiosity, for following me down these long medieval waterways, for staying with the fishermen and the millers and the ferrymen and the washerwomen and the bridge builders and the people who prayed beside the water and the people who feared it and the people who simply could not live without it. These are not famous stories. These are not the stories that get told in the big books about kings and battles. These are the stories that happen every day beside rivers that still run in cities that still stand, and they deserve to be told. You deserve to hear them. If this journey meant something to you, if at any point tonight you felt that pull of recognition, that moment when the past stops being abstract and become somehow personal, please leave a comment below. Tell me which part stayed with you. Tell me which person along the river you found yourself thinking about. Or simply hit like and let the river carry it forward, because there are more stories waiting. The rivers of the medieval world did not run dry in 12 parts. There are still rivers to follow, still banks to walk, still voices in the water that have not yet been heard. The next journey is already ahead of us. Settle in. The current runs on.